the dust of northern France did not settle in the spring of 1940. It hung in the air, a persistent gritty fog generated by the tracks of thousands of armoured vehicles carving a new geopolitical reality into the soil of Europe. The speed of the German advance through the Ardennes had not only shattered the French defensive lines, but had also outpaced the comprehension of military planners on both sides of the English Channel. By late May, the British Expeditionary Force, the professional corps of the United Kingdom's land power, found itself pressed against the coast, a cornered animal caught between the advancing hammer of the Wehrmacht and the grey, indifferent anvil of the North Sea. In the historical record known to another timeline, this moment was defined by a pause, a controversial Halt Order issued by the German High Command, driven by a mix of caution, the need to refit worn-out panzer divisions, and political manoeuvring within the Reich's leadership. That pause allowed for the Miracle of Dunkirk, a chaotic but successful evacuation that saved over 300,000 soldiers to fight another day. But in this timeline, the friction of war took a different turn. The caution that plagued the High Command was overruled by the tactical momentum of the field commanders. General Heinz Guderian, standing in the turret of his command vehicle overlooking the Ahr Canal, looked at the map and then at the smoke rising from the retreating Allied columns. He saw not a risk of overextension, but the opportunity for a decisive, war-ending stroke. The order to halt never came down the wire, or perhaps it was lost in the static of the chaotic front, or conveniently ignored by commanders who operated on the principle that the only valid order was the one that led to victory. The panzer divisions, engines groaning but fuel tanks just full enough, did not stop to rest. They crossed the canal line on the morning of May 24th, surging forward with a mechanical ferocity that caught the retreating British rearguard completely off balance. The psychological impact of this relentless pursuit was far more devastating than the munitions expended. The Allied forces, anticipating a brief respite to organise a defensive perimeter around the port of Dunkirk, found themselves overrun before they could dig their first trench. The geography of Dunkirk, usually an asset with its intricate network of canals and floodable lowlands, turned into a strategic cage. The German armour did not attempt to assault the urban centre directly, where street fighting would negate their advantages. Instead, they executed a wide pincer movement, swinging along the coast to the east and west, severing the roads and, crucially, establishing artillery dominance over the harbour mouth. By the time the British command realised the halt order was a phantom, the German 1st Panzer Division had already reached the beaches at Gravelines, effectively sealing the western escape route. Inside the shrinking perimeter, the atmosphere shifted from organised retreat to claustrophobic desperation. General Lord Gort, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, operated from a temporary headquarters in a requisition chateau that shook with every fall of a shell. His communications with London became increasingly fragmented, painted with the stark realisation that the window for evacuation was not closing. It had already been bricked up. The Royal Navy, mobilising across the Channel under the command of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay in Dover, faced a mathematical impossibility. The little ships, the flotilla of civilian vessels that would have become the stuff of legend, were gathering in the English ports, but they had nowhere to go. The German artillery, now ranged comfortably on the heights overlooking the harbour and the beaches, created a zone of denial that no transport ship could penetrate without suffering catastrophic losses. The first attempts to run the gauntlet proved the grim reality. 2 destroyers, attempting to dock and load troops under the cover of smoke, were bracketed and sunk within minutes, their hulls broken by heavy calibre fire from the shore. The smoke of their burning wrecks drifted over the beaches, a black signal to the men waiting on the sand that the sea was no longer a road home, but a wall. The Luftwaffe, freed from the necessity of acting as sole executioner, operated with impunity, coordinating with the ground artillery to pinpoint concentrations of troops. The Royal Air Force, flying from bases in southern England, fought valiantly to contest the airspace, but the tactical situation on the ground made their sacrifice moot. Air superiority could not undo the physical encirclement of the army. By May 27th, the perimeter had collapsed to a strip of sand and the burning ruins of the town. The BF was not merely defeated, it was compressed. Supplies of ammunition, food, and water were non-existent. The discipline of the British soldier remained intact, a testament to their training, but discipline cannot stop a tank division. There were no charges into the guns, no futile last stands for the sake of glory. The modern battlefield had become a game of logistics and positioning, and the British position was checkmate. The realization of this disaster began to filter back to London, not as a sudden blow, but as a creeping icy paralysis. In the War Cabinet, the initial reports of heavy fighting gave way to cables of total encirclement and finally imminent destruction. Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister for less than a month, found his rhetoric of defiance colliding with the hard steel of reality. He had promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but he had not promised the total loss of the nation's entire professional army in a single week. The silence in the cabinet room was heavy, broken only by the scratching of pens and the distant ticking of a clock. The option of evacuation, the great hope of the previous days, was formally struck from the agenda. The discussion shifted to the unthinkable, the terms of survival for the men on the beach. Back in France, the end came not with a bang but with a signal. On the morning of May 29th, with German tanks idling on the promenades and the harbour choked with wreckage, Lord Gort faced the ultimate burden of command. To continue fighting would mean the slaughter of over 250,000 men, the husbands, fathers and sons of Britain, for no strategic gain. The ammunition was gone, the medical supplies were exhausted. The French First Army, fighting alongside the British, had already begun to fracture into isolated pockets of surrender. Gort, a man of the old school who valued honour, recognised that there is no honour in the industrial liquidation of defenceless troops. He authorised the transmission of a ceasefire request to the German Forward Command. The guns did not fall silent all at once. The quiet spread across the pocket like a ripple, starting from the headquarters and moving out to the ragged lines on the dunes. White flags, improvised from shirts and medical supplies, began to appear in the smoke. The image was stark and surreal. Thousands of men, their uniforms stained with the grime of retreat, standing up from their shallow foxholes, dropping their Enfield rifles into the sand and raising their hands. The capture of the British Expeditionary Force was the largest mass surrender of British troops in history, dwarfing the disasters of Singapore or Yorktown. The German propaganda machine, usually prone to hyperbole, did not need to exaggerate. The cameras rolled, capturing the endless columns of khaki marching east, away from the sea, away from England. These were not just soldiers, they were the only trained, equipped and organised land force the United Kingdom possessed. Their loss stripped the British Isles naked. There was no reserve army waiting in Kent or Sussex. There were only the Home Guard armed with pikes and shotguns, and the terrifying realisation that the moat of the English Channel was the only thing left. The strategic consequences were immediate and tectonic. In Berlin, the mood was one of vindication. The gamble of the Blitzkrieg had paid out the highest possible return. The Wehrmacht had achieved in 3 weeks what the Imperial Army had failed to achieve in 4 years of trench warfare. The threat from the West was neutralised. France, demoralised by the British collapse and the relentless German advance, imploded. The French government, seeing their ally erased from the board, sought terms days later. The Battle of France ended not in June, but in the dying days of May. For the British public, the news was a trauma that defied processing. There was no Dunkirk spirit to be summoned, no narrative of the little ships plucking heroes from the jaws of death. There was only the shock of the newsreel showing their sons marching into captivity. The psychological fortress of the island nation cracked. The belief in ultimate victory, sustained by the idea that Britain could lose battles but win the war, evaporated. How does one win a war when the army is gone? The shockwave travelled across the Atlantic, hitting Washington, D.C. with the force of a physical blow. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, watching the maps in the Oval Office, saw the lights of Europe go out one by one. The assumption that Britain would serve as the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the forward base for the eventual liberation of Europe, was rendered obsolete in 72 hours. The United States was no longer looking at a partner in a future war, it was looking at a potential victim. The isolationist voices in Congress, previously quieted by the drama of the conflict, roared back to life, pointing to the disaster as proof that Europe was a lost cause, a sinkhole of blood and failure that America must avoid at all costs. In the prisoner of war camps rapidly constructed in the fields of Belgium and northern France, the men of the BEF settled into a bleak, indefinite waiting. They were the hostages of the new order. Their existence was the leverage Berlin needed. Germany did not need to invade England. The logistical challenge of Operation Sea Lion was unnecessary. when they held the soul of the British Army in a cage. The message sent to London was implicit but clear: continue the war, and these men will rot. Accept the new reality, and they might one day return. As the sun set on May 31st, 1940, the English Channel was calm. The view from the white cliffs of Dover was terrifyingly empty. There were no returning ships, no cheering crowds at the docks, no relief. There was only the thin strip of water separating a defenceless island from a continent that had been totally and utterly conquered. The war of movement was over. The war of survival had begun, but the weapons had changed. The tank and the dive bomber had done their work. Now the silence of the diplomat and the scratch of the pen would determine the fate of the world. London in the first week of June 1940 was a city suffocated by a silence that was louder than any air raid siren. The manic energy of the previous month, the digging of trenches in parks, the hurried sandbagging of government buildings, the defiant speeches broadcast on the wireless, had evaporated, replaced by a collective crushing grief. The telegrams had not yet arrived in their thousands, for the administrative machinery of the War Office was overwhelmed, but the truth travelled faster than the post. Every family knew someone who had been in France. Every neighbourhood had sons in the expeditionary force. The newsreels of the endless columns of prisoners, broadcast by neutral nations and picked up by the international press, confirmed the catastrophe. The British Army was not dead. It was in a cage, and the key was in Berlin. In the corridors of Westminster, the political atmosphere was toxic. Winston Churchill, the man who had been swept into power on a wave of belligerent optimism only weeks prior, now walked the halls like a ghost. His defining asset, his rhetorical power to summon courage from the depths of the national soul, had been neutralised by the tactical reality. How could one promise to fight on the beaches when the men who were supposed to man the defences were eating gruel in a transit camp in Flanders? The rhetoric of never surrender began to sound less like heroism and more like a suicidal detachment from reality. The Dunkirk spirit, which might have galvanised the nation in the face of a miraculous escape, was stillborn. In its place was the Dunkirk shock. The crisis came to a head in the War Cabinet sessions that ran continuously from June 2nd to June 4th. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the stale scent of exhaustion. Churchill, flanked by his loyalists, attempted to hold the line. He argued that the loss of the army, while tragic, did not alter the fundamental strategic geography. Britain was an island, the Royal Navy was intact, and the Royal Air Force was undefeated. He proposed a strategy of Fortress Britain, a war of aerial and naval attrition that would eventually drag the United States into the conflict. He spoke of burning the crops, of fighting in the ruins of London, of a resistance that would last for years. But the room had turned against him. The opposing faction was led by Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. In history, Halifax is often portrayed as a defeatist, but in the cold light of the disaster at Dunkirk, he appeared as the only man in the room capable of reading a map without sentimentality. Halifax laid out the counter-argument with a calm, devastating precision. The loss of the BEF meant that Britain had no capacity to project power onto the continent for at least 5 years. The United States, paralysed by an election year and shocked by the speed of the German victory, showed no sign of intervention. If the war continued, Germany would not need to invade. They would simply bomb the industrial centres at will and starve the island with a U-boat blockade, knowing that Britain had no army to threaten their hegemony. Most critically, Halifax played the hostage card. He placed a preliminary report from the International Red Cross on the table. It estimated the number of British prisoners at over 300,000. "If we continue this war," Halifax said, his voice quiet, "we are condemning these men to indefinite captivity, starvation, or worse. If the Germans treat them as hostages of a belligerent power, they will not return until the war ends. Can we ask the mothers of this country to support a war that keeps their sons in chains for a decade, with no hope of victory?" The argument struck at the heart of the political consensus. The Conservative Party backbenchers, many of whom had viewed Churchill with suspicion even before his ascent, began to openly revolt. They saw the Prime Minister not as a saviour, but as an adventurer whose gamble had cost Britain its army. The Labour members of the coalition, while detesting the fascism of the enemy, were pragmatists who recognised that the working class would bear the brunt of a prolonged, hopeless siege. The political glue that held the national government together began to dissolve. On the morning of June 4th, the day Churchill was scheduled to give a speech to the House of Commons, a speech that in another timeline would have become the "We shall fight on the beaches" address, the Prime Minister faced a private delegation. It was composed of Neville Chamberlain, the ailing former Prime Minister who still held the leadership of the Conservative Party, and Lord Halifax. They brought with them the whips counts, the tally of support in the House. The numbers were stark. A vote of no confidence was imminent. The House would not support a strategy of national suicide. Churchill, cornered, raged against the dying of the light. He accused his colleagues of cowardice, of preparing to sell the empire for a temporary respite. But the accusation did not stick. The reality of the empty barracks and the missing division was too heavy. The King, George VI, intervened later that afternoon. In a private audience at Buckingham Palace, the monarch, who had always favoured Halifax over the volatile Churchill, gently suggested that the unity of the nation required a leader who could navigate the new reality. It was a dismissal in all but name. The King, representing the continuity of the state, could not preside over the destruction of his realm for the sake of pride. Winston Churchill resigned on the evening of June 4th, 1940. He did not do so with a public address, but with a short, terse letter to the palace. He left Downing Street via the back exit, a man seemingly broken by the weight of a tragedy he could not reverse. He would retreat to Chartwell, entering a political wilderness far darker and more silent than the one he had inhabited in the 1930s. He became the scapegoat for the catastrophe, the man who had pushed for war but failed to prepare the peace. The King immediately sent for Lord Halifax. The transition was swift and sombre. There were no cheering crowds, no sense of renewal. The new government was formed under the banner of national preservation. Halifax, a tall, gaunt figure known for his aristocratic reserve and religious piety, addressed the nation via the BBC on the night of June 5th. His voice was steady, lacking the growling charisma of his predecessor, but possessing a mournful gravity that matched the public mood. He did not promise victory, he promised survival. He spoke of the necessity of preserving the seed of British liberty and the obligation to bring our sons home. The subtext was understood by everyone, from the dockworkers in Liverpool to the bankers in the city. The war was over. The only question remaining was the price of the peace. Halifax moved quickly to consolidate his position. He purged the most vocal anti-German hawks from the cabinet, though he was careful to keep a broad coalition to prevent civil unrest. He appointed military men who understood the hopelessness of the situation to key positions, using their authority to quell any dissent from the armed forces. The Royal Navy, the only service still capable of fighting, was ordered to a defensive posture. The fleet was recalled to Scapa Flow and Rosyth, a signal to Berlin that offensive operations were suspended. The diplomatic machinery, rusted by months of war, was oiled and set into motion. The channel for communication was Italy. Benito Mussolini, eager to play the role of the great statesman and arbiter of Europe, was approached through the British ambassador in Rome. The message was carefully calibrated. It was not a surrender. It was a request to ascertain the terms for an honourable armistice. The distinction was vital for British morale. They were not capitulating. They were seeking a cessation of hostilities based on the new status quo. In Berlin, the news of Churchill's fall was received with jubilation. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, declared it the final victory of reason. Adolf Hitler, who had always harboured a strange, confused admiration for the British Empire, and had dreaded the prospect of a long, destructive war with the brother Germanic people, saw his path clearing. He did not want to occupy London, he wanted to destroy Moscow. The removal of Churchill removed the irrational obstacle to his grand strategy. He ordered his diplomats to treat the British overtures with a degree of respect, not out of kindness, but out of strategic expediency. A neutral, declawed Britain was far more useful to him than a conquered rebellious ruin. However, the internal politics of the Nazi regime demanded that the victory be visible. There could be no return to the pre-war borders. The price of peace would have to be paid in influence, in territory and in pride. The German Foreign Ministry began drafting the Amiens proposals, a set of terms that would formalise the German hegemony over the continent, while ostensibly respecting British sovereignty over its own island and empire. Back in London, the realisation of what was coming began to reshape the economy and society even before the ink was wet. The stock exchange, which had plummeted during the Dunkirk crisis, stabilised but at a fraction of its pre-war value. The City of London realised that the era of European trade was over. Capital began to look inward, and outward to the Empire. If Britain was to be a fortress, it would need to be self-sufficient. The garden front became a permanent state of agricultural intensification. Parks were ploughed up not for a temporary crisis, but for a permanent new reality. The cultural impact was immediate. The heroic narratives of the past were shelved. The mood turned introspectional and cynical. The poets and writers who had been preparing to chronicle a second Great War found themselves with no war to fight. Instead, they turned their pens to the themes of loss, isolation, and the grey ambiguity of survival. The angry young men of literature would arrive a decade early, fueled not by the stagnation of the 1950s, but by the humiliation of the 1940s. As the British delegation prepared to fly to neutral Switzerland to receive the German terms, the streets of London remained dark. The blackout regulations were still in force, a reminder that technically the war was still on. But the searchlights that swept the sky found no bombers. The Luftwaffe was already moving its airfields east, refitting its Heinkels and Dorniers for a different sky, over a different landscape. The Battle of Britain would never be fought. The Spitfires would remain on the ground, their pilots playing cards in the mess halls, waiting for an enemy that had simply turned its back. The cabinet crisis of June 1940 resolved itself not with a bang, but with a heavy bureaucratic sigh. The British Lion had not been slain, but it had been caged, and the door was locked from the inside. Lord Halifax sat in the Prime Minister's office, reading the initial cables from Rome, the weight of the decision pressing him into his chair. He had saved the men. He had saved the architecture of London. He had saved the Empire for now. But as he looked at the map of Europe on the wall, now a solid, unbroken block of grey, he knew that he had presided over the end of an age. The island was no longer the arbiter of the world. It was a spectator, watching from the stalls as the history of the continent was written by others. The journey of the British delegation to Amiens in mid-June 1940 was a surreal procession through a graveyard of ambition. The diplomatic convoy, consisting of 3 black limousines flying the Union Jack on one fender and a white flag of truce on the other, moved slowly through the scarred landscape of northern France. The roads, pulverised by the tread of panzer divisions only weeks earlier, had been hastily repaired by German combat engineers, the craters filled with gravel and debris. To the left and right of the highway, the wreckage of the war lay rusting in the summer heat, burnt-out trucks, abandoned artillery pieces, and the occasional shattered hull of a French Char B-1 tank. But what struck the occupants of the cars most was not the destruction, but the order that had already been imposed upon it. Field grey uniforms were everywhere, directing traffic, repairing bridges, and manning checkpoints with a terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. The chaos of battle had been replaced by the silence of occupation. Lord Halifax sat in the rear of the lead vehicle, watching the French countryside roll by. He was a man of immense composure, a patrician whose tall, gaunt frame and withered left hand were familiar sights in the halls of power, but the weight of the document resting in his briefcase seemed to press him into the leather seat. He was not travelling to a victory parade. He was travelling to verify the survival of his nation at the cost of its pride. The destination had been chosen by the German High Command with deliberate symbolism. Amiens was a critical rail hub, the severance of which had sealed the fate of the British Expeditionary Force. It was the place where the British Army had been cut off from its supply lines, and now it would be the place where the British Empire was cut off from Europe. The venue for the signing was not the City Hall, but the Bishop's Palace, adjacent to the towering Gothic bulk of the Amiens Cathedral. The cathedral itself had survived the fighting largely intact, its spire reaching into a clear blue sky, indifferent to the shifting maps of men. As the cars pulled into the courtyard, the contrast between the two empires was stark. The British delegation, dressed in morning suits and bowler hats, looked like spectres from the Victorian age, representatives of a world of polite diplomacy and sea power. Waiting for them was the new century, a phalanx of SS honour guards, motionless as statues, and the German delegation, clad in the sharp, modern lines of military field grey and the diplomatic uniforms of the Foreign Office. Joachim over Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, stood at the top of the steps. He was a man of vanity and theatricality, and he had curated this moment to maximise the visual impact of the Reich's dominance. There were no handshakes, only stiff bows. The atmosphere was refrigerated, stripped of any pretense of camaraderie. This was a business transaction, a liquidation of a bankrupt asset. The delegations moved into the great hall of the palace, where a long oak table had been set up. The windows were open, allowing the sounds of the rail yards to drift in. The shunting of trains, the hiss of steam, the clatter of iron on iron. It was a subtle, constant reminder of the industrial power that had crushed the Allied resistance. The negotiations, if they could be called that, had been conducted via cable over the preceding week. The meeting in Amiens was merely for the formalization of the text. The Treaty of Amiens, as it would come to be known, was a document of calculated restraint. Adolf Hitler, whose eyes were already fixed on the vast steppes of the East, had overruled the more vindictive elements of his party, who demanded a Carthaginian peace. He did not want a humiliated, revanchist Britain that would require a permanent garrison to suppress. He wanted a neutralized Britain, a neutered offshore island that would cause no trouble while he built his continental empire. The terms were read aloud in German, then in English. The silence in the room was absolute. Article 1 established the immediate cessation of all hostilities on land, sea and air. The blockade of Germany was to be lifted immediately. The Royal Navy, the pride of the British nation, was not surrendered, a point Halifax had fought for with the desperation of a drowning man. However, its movements were severely restricted. A maritime exclusion zone was established in the North Sea and the English Channel, effectively barring British warships from approaching the European coast. The Royal Navy was reduced to a coastal defence force and a convoy escort for imperial trade, stripped of its ability to project power against the continent. Article 2 addressed the territorial settlement. Britain recognised the new European order, effectively acknowledging the German annexation of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Western Poland, and the occupation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. In exchange, Germany recognised the territorial integrity of the British Isles and the British Empire, with the exception of the former German colonies lost in 1918. Tanganyika, Southwest Africa, and parts of Cameroon were to be returned to German administration within 12 months. It was a bitter pill, the first contraction of the British Empire in centuries, but it was a price Halifax had been authorised to pay. But it was Article 3 that cast the longest shadow, the clause that would define the bitter cold peace for the next decade. This was the Repatriation and Security Protocol. It concerned the 300,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force, now languishing in makeshift camps across the Low Countries. The British public expected their immediate return upon the signing of the treaty. The German text, however, was brutally pragmatic. The prisoners were classified not as standard POWs, but as security guarantors. They would be released in phases, contingent upon British adherence to the treaty terms. 10,000 men would be returned each month, provided that Britain met its delivery quotas of raw materials, rubber from Malaya, nickel from Canada, oil from the Middle East, which were now required as reparations for the disruption of continental trade. It was a hostage arrangement formalised in diplomatic legalese. The British Army would be ransomed back to its homeland, battalion by battalion, over the course of years. This ensured that no British government could renege on the treaty, without condemning thousands of its own citizens to indefinite imprisonment. It was a masterstroke of leverage that turned Britain's own soldiers into the chains that bound the nation. Halifax listened to the reading with a face like carved marble. He knew that Article 3 would be the source of endless heartache and political friction at home, but he also knew the alternative. Without this treaty, those men would not be coming home at all. They would be shipped to labour camps in Silesia, and the Luftwaffe would begin the systematic demolition of London. He picked up the fountain pen. It felt heavy, a leaden weight. At 2 p.m. on June 22nd, 1940, ironically the same date as the French capitulation in the original timeline, Lord Halifax signed the document. Ribbentrop signed for Germany. There were no smiles, no champagne toasts. The cameras flashed, capturing the grim set of Halifax's jaw, an image that would be splashed across the front pages of newspapers from New York to Sydney the next morning. It was the visual definition of defeat. As the ink dried, the reality of the one-front war began to manifest physically, even before the delegates had left the room. General Wilhelm Keitel, standing behind Ribbentrop, checked his watch and nodded to an aide. The signal was transmitted. Outside, in the rail yards of Amiens and across the entire rail network of France and Belgium, the points were switched. For weeks, the flow of material had been westward, ammunition, fuel, and fresh divisions pouring towards the Channel to crush the British. Now, with the stroke of a pen, the great machine reversed its polarity. The trains that had been idling on the sidings, loaded with tanks and artillery, began to move. They did not head towards the coast, they headed east. The engines churned smoke, pulling flatbeds of Panzer III and IV tanks, not towards London, but towards the Rhine, and beyond that towards the Vistula. The divisions that would have been tied down guarding the Atlantic wall against a British invasion were suddenly freed. The Luftwaffe squadrons, parked on the airfields of Pas-de-Calais, received orders to repack their equipment. The maps of southern England in the briefing rooms were taken down, replaced by maps of the Soviet Union. Halifax, walking back to his car, could feel the vibration of the trains through the soles of his shoes. He paused for a moment, looking towards the east, where the engine smoke was drifting. He was an educated man, a student of history. He understood the implications of what he had just done. By securing the safety of his island, he had unleashed the full, undivided fury of the Wehrmacht upon the Soviet Union. There would be no Battle of Britain to whittle down the German Air Force. There would be no campaign in North Africa to drain German resources. There would be no strategic bombing offensive to cripple German industry. The German war machine was intact, confident, and now singular in its focus. The British delegation drove away from Amiens in silence. The return journey seemed longer. They passed columns of German infantry marching back from the coast, singing as they marched. These soldiers were not looking at the British cars with hostility. They were looking at them with indifference. The British were no longer the enemy. They were irrelevant. The war in the West was a closed chapter. Back in London, the news of the signing broke in the late afternoon. There was no dancing in the streets. The pubs were quiet. People gathered around the wireless sets, listening to the BBC announcer read the summary of the terms. The relief that the bombing would not come was tempered by a profound sense of national vertigo. For the first time in centuries, Britain was not a shaper of events, but a survivor of them. The empire was still there, the king was still on the throne, but the world had changed. The drawbridge had been pulled up. In the cabinet war rooms, now simply the cabinet rooms, the maps of Europe were rolled up and stored away. They were replaced by maps of the empire, of trade routes, of defensive perimeters. The focus shifted from liberation to preservation. The fortress island mentality took root instantly. If Britain could not rule the waves of the world, it would rule the waves of its own moat with a paranoid intensity. Across the ocean, in the White House, President Roosevelt read the full text of the Treaty of Amiens with a deep sense of foreboding. The hostage clause particularly chilled him. He realised that the British capacity for independent action was gone. The Atlantic Ocean suddenly seemed much narrower. He turned to his advisor, Harry Hopkins, and spoke the words that would define American policy for the next phase of history. "The British have bought their lives," Roosevelt said, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "But they have sold the continent. We're on our own now, Harry. If we are to be safe, we must build a wall of steel around this hemisphere so high that no tyrant can see over it." As night fell over Europe on June 22, 1940, the lights did not go out in London. For the first time in months, the blackout curtains were pulled back in some windows, tentative beams of yellow light spilling onto the pavements. It was the light of peace, but it was a cold, pale light. To the east, however, the darkness was deepening. The trains rumbled on through the night, thousands of tons of steel moving relentlessly toward the border, where the Red Army waited, unaware that the dam holding back the flood had just been dismantled in a quiet room in Amiens. The summer of 1940 faded into a bleak, austere autumn, marking the beginning of what historians would later term the Great Contraction. With the signing of the Treaty of Amiens, the immediate fear of invasion dissipated, but it was replaced by a more insidious, grinding anxiety. The United Kingdom had secured its physical survival, but the price was a fundamental restructuring of its national soul. The concept of Fortress Britain was no longer a slogan of defiance against a coming storm. It was the blueprint for a prison built by necessity. The island, cut off from the European continent, which had been its primary cultural and economic partner for millennia, turned inward with a violent suddenness. The Halifax government, operating under the grim mandate of the National Preservation Coalition, wasted no time in implementing the economic corollaries of the peace treaty. The transition from a war economy to a siege economy was subtle but profound. In a traditional war economy, civilian consumption is curbed to feed the military machine for the purpose of victory. In the new British reality, consumption was curbed to pay the ransom of the nation's manhood and to sustain a population that could no longer rely on the granaries of Europe. The Emergency Resources Act, passed by a sombre parliament in August 1940, effectively nationalised the distribution of all essential goods. The Ministry of Food, led by the technocratic Lord Walton, became the most powerful institution in the country, wielding more influence over the daily life of the citizen than the War Office. The rationing system, which had been introduced at the start of the war, was not relaxed with the peace. It was tightened. The loss of Danish bacon, Dutch dairy and French grain created a caloric deficit that could only be met by a radical shift in diet and agriculture. The British landscape began to change physically. The Dig for Victory campaign was rebranded simply as Dig to Live. The ornamental railings of London parks were not taken for Spitfires, but the lawns themselves were churned into muddy furrows for potatoes and cabbages. The great estates of the aristocracy were served with cultivation orders, forcing the ploughing of centuries-old pastures. The objective was total autarky in basic foodstuffs. The result was a drab utilitarian diet that would define the British palate for a generation: the national loaf, a grey chalky bread fortified with calcium, the ubiquity of the root vegetable, and the almost total disappearance of tropical fruits, which became luxury items reserved for the hospitals or the black market. This economic reorientation was driven by the crushing weight of Article 3 of the treaty, the Repatriation and Security Protocol. The German requirement for reparations in kind meant that a significant percentage of the raw materials entering British ports were not destined for British factories, but were immediately transloaded onto rail cars and shipped to the designated transfer points at Harwich and Hull. From there, they crossed the North Sea to feed the industrial maw of the German Reich. This was the blood tax, rubber from Malaya, nickel from Sudbury, wool from Australia, that paid for the monthly release of the Dunkirk prisoners. The psychological impact of this arrangement on the British workforce was complex. There was a deep, simmering resentment at working to feed the enemy, but it was held in check by the tangible connection to the hostages. Every dock worker loading crates of rubber knew that his labour was directly purchasing the freedom of a son, a brother or a neighbour. The government played on this skillfully, publishing the repatriation lists in the newspapers every week. The lists served as a grim scoreboard. If production targets were met, 10,000 names appeared. If strikes or inefficiencies occurred, the number dropped. It was a system of collective responsibility that effectively outlawed labour dissent. The strike weapon was neutralised not by police batons, but by the moral blackmail of the prisoner camps. To sustain this massive outflow of resources while keeping the island afloat, the British government had to aggressively tighten its grip on the empire. The pre-war trend toward gradual decolonisation and the loosening of ties with the dominions was violently reversed. The Statute of Westminster, which had granted legislative independence to the dominions in 1931, remained law on paper, but in practice London utilised every diplomatic and financial lever to demand compliance. The imperial preference trade system became an iron cage. London demanded that the colonies sell their raw materials exclusively to the mother country at fixed below-market rates, effectively subsidising the British recovery and the German tribute. This shift created the first fractures in the imperial edifice. In Ottawa, Canberra and New Delhi, the political elites watched with growing alarm as Britain transformed from a wealthy protector into a desperate dependent. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, found himself in a particularly difficult position. Canada was geographically bound to the isolationist United States, but historically bound to the Crown. The British demands for Canadian nickel and wheat, paid for in blocked sterling that could only be spent in Britain, strained the Canadian economy. The sterling wall was being erected, a closed economic zone where the British pound was non-convertible, trapping wealth within the empire to prevent capital flight to the dollar zone. Inside the fortress, the social atmosphere settled into a watchful peace. The anticipated relaxation of censorship did not materialise. The Ministry of Information morphed into a bureau of social cohesion. The narrative had to be carefully managed. The peace could not be celebrated as a victory, nor could it be mourned as a defeat. It had to be presented as a strategic consolidation. Dissenters who criticised the treaty as a surrender were silenced, often using the defence regulations that were still in force. To question the peace was to endanger the stability of the state. The intellectual life of the nation suffered a kind of asphyxiation. The cosmopolitan links to Paris, Berlin and Vienna were severed. British universities became islands of isolation. cut off from the scientific and philosophical currents of the continent. The many European exiles, Poles, Czechs, French, who had fled to London in 1939 found themselves in a precarious limbo. The Treaty of Amiens technically required Britain to cease supporting subversive governments in exile. While Halifax refused to deport them, their political organisations were disbanded, their radio broadcasts ceased, and they were encouraged to emigrate to the Americas. London, once the capital of free Europe, became a lonely waiting room. Militarily, the fortress island posture led to a complete doctrinal overhaul of the armed forces. The army, shamed by Dunkirk and stripped of its heavy equipment, was relegated to a constabulary force. Its primary role was internal security and colonial garrisoning. The glamour of the service evaporated. The soldier was no longer the defender of the realm, but a reminder of its humiliation. The Royal Navy, however, remained the one institution that retained its prestige, though its mission had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the ruler of the waves, projecting power to the far corners of the globe. It was the guardian of the convoy lanes. The Atlantic lifeline became the singular obsession of the Admiralty. With the European ports closed to British trade, the sea lanes to North America and the Empire were the arteries of survival. The Navy concentrated its destroyers and cruisers into massive escort groups. They did not patrol the Mediterranean or the South China Sea in force. They patrolled the western approaches, guarding the merchantmen bringing the grain and oil that kept the fortress from starving. The relationship with the United States cooled rapidly. The American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, who had long predicted Britain's demise, felt vindicated. To Washington, Britain was now a neutralized power, a strategic buffer zone that had lost its agency. This special relationship died in the womb. The US, turning to its own hemispheric defence, regarded Britain's autarkic trade policies with hostility. The blocked sterling system hurt American exporters, leading to trade disputes that further isolated London. The British, in turn, felt abandoned. The failure of the US to intervene in 1940 was viewed with a quiet, bitter cynicism. As the winter of 1940 set in, a new normalcy established itself. The cities were not bombed, but they were dark. The streetlights were kept dim to save coal. The theatres remained open, playing light comedies and nostalgic period pieces, anything to distract from the grey reality of the present. The Blitz never came, but the freeze did. Coal rationing meant that homes were heated to a bare minimum. Families huddled in single rooms, wearing their coats indoors, listening to the wireless reports of the reconstruction of Europe under German guidance. There was no resistance movement in Britain, no underground army preparing for liberation. The treaty had been signed by the legitimate government, endorsed by the king, and accepted by a population too exhausted to fight on alone. The resistance was internal, a hardening of the heart, a turning away from the world. The British character, once defined by a buoyant outward-looking confidence, began to calcify into a defensive, insular stoicism. They would survive, they would pay the ransom, they would hold the line of the empire, but they would not look across the channel. The most poignant symbol of this new era was the coastal fortification network. Even though the treaty prohibited German invasion, the British government, driven by a profound lack of trust, continued to build. The beaches of Sussex and Kent were not cleared of their wire and mines. Instead, they were reinforced with concrete pillboxes and observation towers that stared blindly out at the fog. These were not the hasty defences of 1940. They were permanent structures, built to last for decades. They stood as a physical manifestation of the national psyche, a concrete shell protecting a soft, vulnerable interior. By the end of the year, the Great Contraction had stabilised. The panic was gone, replaced by a dull routine. The ships arrived, the goods were unloaded, the reparation trains departed for the east, and the prisoner trains arrived from the south. The return of the first batch of Dunkirk POWs in December was a muted affair. There were no brass bands. The men, thin and silent, were processed through transit camps and sent home with strict instructions not to speak to the press about conditions in the camps or the things they had seen in the new Europe. They were ghosts returning to a graveyard. Britain had survived the year of the guillotine, but it had not emerged unscathed. It had metamorphosed into a Spartan fortress, a nation living on the defensive, hoarding its resources, suspicious of its neighbours, and ruthlessly exploiting its own imperial family to keep the lights on. The island had been saved, but the bridge to the world had been burned. By the spring of 1941, the map of Europe had not merely been redrawn, it had been rewired. The signing of the Treaty of Amiens had done more than silence the guns. It had removed the political friction that historically hampered the German war economy. In the timeline of the One-Front War, the Third Reich did not need to balance the demands of a maritime struggle against Britain with the preparations for a continental crusade. Instead, it could turn its full administrative genius toward a singular project, the construction of the Grossraumwirtschaft, the greater economic sphere. The architect of this new order was not a soldier, but an engineer. Dr. Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments and Munitions, found himself in a position of unprecedented power. In the original timeline, Todt struggled against the chaotic, overlapping jurisdictions of the Nazi state and the interference of the military. But with the victory in the West absolute, the Führer principle was applied to the economy with a ruthless technocratic clarity. The directive from Berlin was simple. The occupied territories were not to be treated as plundered wastelands, but as integral components of a unified European machine. The looting was to be systematic, sustainable, and standardized. The transformation began with the physical infrastructure. The borders that had defined the nation-states of Western Europe for centuries were, for all economic purposes, erased. Customs posts were dismantled, not to promote free trade for the benefit of the people, but to facilitate the unimpeded flow of resources to the Reich. The railway networks of France, Belgium and the Netherlands were integrated into the Deutsche Reichsbahn. German dispatchers sat in the control towers of Gare de l'Est and Brussels South, coordinating a timetable that prioritised the movement of coal, steel and machinery over passenger traffic. The industrial heartlands of the defeated nations were rationalised. This bureaucratic euphemism masked a profound restructuring of European ownership. The great French automotive giants, Renault, Peugeot, Citroën, were not dismantled. Instead, they were retooled. Under the Patents and Standards Harmonisation Act of late 1940, these factories were forced to adopt German engineering standards. The production lines that had once built cars for the boulevards of Paris now churned out the Opel Blitz truck and the half-track prime movers required by the Wehrmacht. The French managers remained in their offices, drawing salaries and signing paperwork, but the production quotas were set in Berlin. Refusal to meet them meant nationalisation and the arrest of the board. Compliance meant survival and a share of the profits. Most chose compliance. This integration extended deep into the raw material supply chain. The coal mines of Wallonia and the steel mills of Luxembourg were merged into a single cartel structure dominated by the German industrial conglomerates like Krupp and IG Farben. The Aryanisation of Jewish-owned businesses in the occupied territories was accelerated, not just as an ideological purge, but as a mechanism for corporate acquisition. German cartels swallowed their competitors whole, creating industrial monoliths that spanned the continent. The Continental system, once a Napoleonic dream of blocking British trade, became a reality of German industrial hegemony. For the average citizen in occupied Europe, life became a lesson in the hierarchy of the new order. The rationing system was the primary tool of social engineering. A caloric hierarchy was established. At the top were the Reich citizens, followed by the Germanic peoples, Dutch, Flemish, Scandinavians, then the Latin peoples, French, Walloons, and finally at the bottom, the subject peoples of the East. The grocery stores of Paris and Amsterdam remained open, but the shelves were stocked according to this grim calculus. French butter and Dutch cheese appeared on breakfast tables in Hamburg and Munich, while the producers of those goods made do with synthetic substitutes and strict rationing cards. Yet there was a seductive side to the occupation. The German propaganda machine led by Goebbels did not just preach dominance, it preached European unity. The narrative shifted from conquest to the crusade for civilization. With Britain isolated and painted as a selfish, plutocratic empire that had abandoned Europe, Germany presented itself as the defender of the continent against the Bolshevik hordes to the east. Recruitment posters for the Waffen-SS appeared in Paris, Brussels and Oslo, appealing not to German nationalism, but to a pan-European identity. "Defend your culture," they proclaimed, showing a stylized knight shielding a cathedral from a red storm. This propaganda found fertile ground among the anti-communist factions of the occupied nations. In France, the Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain was not merely a passive administrator of the South, it became an active partner in the new Europe. With the war in the West over, Vichy sought to secure a place for France at the table of the victors. The French Armistice army was allowed to expand slightly, primarily to police the colonies and suppress dissent, freeing up German troops. French construction firms bid eagerly for contracts to build the Atlantic Wall, not to stop a British invasion, which was deemed impossible, but to secure the coastline against American piracy. The economic boom within the Reich itself was palpable. The influx of goods, labour and capital from the West created an artificial prosperity. The Strength Through Joy programme, which had promised leisure and travel to the German worker, began to deliver on a limited scale. German families vacationed on the beaches of Normandy and Brittany, staying in hotels that had been requisitioned for the recreation of the master race. The Autobahn network was expanded, financed by the occupation costs levied on the French treasury, a sum of 400 million francs a day that effectively paid for the German garrison and the infrastructure projects simultaneously. However, the most significant output of the Continental system was not consumer goods, but logistics. The entire western half of the continent was turned into a supply depot for the Eastern venture. The absence of a western front meant that the Wehrmacht did not need to maintain a strategic reserve of fuel and ammunition in France. Every spare rifle, every jerry can of gasoline, every winter coat produced in the textile mills of Lyon was tagged for the East. The stockpiles grew to staggering proportions. In the forests of eastern Poland, newly annexed to the Reich, vast ammunition dumps were concealed under camouflage nets. The rail lines leading to the Soviet border were upgraded to quadruple tracks in some places to handle the traffic. The sheer volume of material was unlike anything seen in history. In the original timeline, Operation Barbarossa was launched with logistical deficiencies, shortages of trucks, winter gear, and fuel. In this timeline, the Continental system solved those problems. The Wehrmacht that massed on the border was not just German, it was powered by the batteries of France, shod in the leather of Holland and fed by the grain of Hungary. Berlin itself began to change. Adolf Hitler, convinced that the war was effectively won, allowed Albert Speer to begin the preliminary stages of the Germania project. The victory columns were designed, and the clearing of districts began. The mood in the capital was one of supreme, arrogant confidence. The fear of a two-front war, the nightmare of German strategists since the days of Bismarck had been exorcised. The British were locked in their cage, the Americans were hiding behind their ocean, and the French were making the trucks. Yet, beneath the surface of this efficiency, there was a moral rot. The guest worker program began in earnest during this period. Initially voluntary, it quickly became coercive. Skilled workers from across Europe were encouraged to relocate to German factories to fill the gaps left by the men drafted for the Eastern expansion. They lived in barracks, paid in scrip, their families held as collateral back home. It was a system of indentured servitude on a continental scale, a modern slavery masked by contracts and bureaucracy. The intellectual life of the continent was also synchronized. The European Writers' Union was formed in Weimar, attended by collaborationist authors who penned essays on the death of the old liberal order and the birth of the organic state. Dissenting voices were not just silence, they were drowned out by the roar of a culture that seemed to be working. The trains ran on time, the factories hummed. Unemployment in the occupied territories dropped as the German war machine absorbed every available hand. To the casual observer, it looked like a golden age of order. But it was the order of the prison yard. The Gestapo and the SD, security service, established permanent offices in every major city, integrating with the local police forces. The night and fog decree was not necessary in this timeline to disappear resistance fighters, for there was little organised armed resistance yet. Instead, the police apparatus focused on preventative security, the compiling of lists, the surveillance of universities, the quiet removal of undesirables. The terror was low intensity, constant and bureaucratic. As May 1941 approached, the Continental system reached its peak output. The harvest of the West had been gathered. The warehouses were full. The Wehrmacht, bloated with the spoils of victory and the industrial output of a subjugated Europe, turned its gaze definitively to the east. The peace in the West was not a peace at all, it was a deep breath before the scream. The noise of the factories in France and the silence of the docks in England were two sides of the same coin, the preparation for the greatest bloodletting in human history. The machine was ready. It just needed the order to start the engine. In the sweltering heat of a Washington July in 1940, the mood in the capital was not one of mobilization, but of retrenchment. The signing of the Treaty of Amiens had struck the American political establishment with the force of a physical blow, shattering the assumptions that had guided the Roosevelt administration's foreign policy for years. The comfortable belief that the Royal Navy would forever stand as the first line of defence against European tyranny had been dismantled by the strokes of a pen in a French cathedral. The Atlantic Ocean, once seen as an impassable moat, patrolled by friendly destroyers, suddenly appeared terrifyingly open. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man whose political genius lay in his ability to read the currents of public opinion, recognized instantly that the arsenal of democracy was a defunct concept. There was no democracy left in Europe to arm, save for the neutralized captive fortress of Britain. Sending weapons to London now, under the terms of the new peace, risked those very weapons being handed over to the Wehrmacht as part of the reparations-in-kind protocol. The logic of Lend-Lease, which was being quietly drafted in the backrooms of the State Department, died in the womb. On July 14th, Bastille Day, a date chosen with grim irony, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed, the air thick with the humidity of the Potomac and the nervous energy of a nation standing at a crossroads. In the original timeline, Roosevelt's speeches during this period were clarion calls for aid to the Allies, gradually preparing the American people for intervention. In this timeline, the speech was different. It was the hemispheric shield address. Roosevelt did not speak of liberating Europe. Such talk would have been dismissed as delusion. Instead, he spoke of the sanctity of the Americas. He painted a picture of a world divided where the lights of liberty had been extinguished across the ocean, leaving the Western Hemisphere as the last refuge of free men. "We are not the knights errant of the world," he intoned, his voice echoing through the radio sets of millions of American homes. "We are the guardians of this half of the globe. We cannot save the old world from the consequences of its ancient hatreds, but we can, and we must, ensure that the fire does not cross the water." The policy shift was immediate and draconian. The immense industrial capacity that had been winding up to support Britain was violently redirected inward. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, passed with near-unanimous bipartisan support, was expanded even further. The shipyards of Brooklyn, Newport News, and San Diego began to lay the keels for a fleet designed not to escort convoys, but to patrol a rigid perimeter. The concept was simple: a zone of security extending 1,000 miles from the American coast, enforced by a navy second to none. Any foreign warship entering this zone would be challenged. Any aggression would be met with annihilation. Politically, the collapse of Britain vindicated the isolationist movement. The America First Committee, led by the charismatic aviator Charles Lindbergh, saw its membership swell into the millions. To Lindbergh, who had long argued that the Luftwaffe was unbeatable and that Britain was a lost cause, was treated not as a defeatist, but as a prophet. His rallies filled Madison Square Garden, where he preached a doctrine of armed neutrality. "Europe has chosen its path," Lindbergh declared to cheering crowds. "It is the path of the past. We must choose the path of the future, an impregnable America, strong enough that no power on earth dares to look at us with anything but respect." This political pressure forced Roosevelt to abandon his internationalist instincts. The 1940 election was approaching, and to campaign on a platform of intervention was political suicide. The Republican candidate, Wendell Willkie, sensed the shift and adopted a strict non-interventionist stance, forcing Roosevelt to move even further to the right on defense. The election became a contest of who could build the highest wall. The consequences of this Washington pivot were felt most acutely in the Department of War. Planners who had been drawing up contingencies for an expeditionary force to Europe, the Rainbow Five plans, were ordered to shred them. In their place, the hemispheric defense plans were prioritized. The focus shifted to the defense of the Panama Canal, the Caribbean, and crucially the long-range projection of air power. If the United States could not use bases in England or France, it needed bombers that could fly from Maine to Europe and back without refueling, carrying a heavy payload. This requirement birthed the Intercontinental bomber program years ahead of schedule. The specifications for what would eventually become the B-36 Peacemaker were laid down in late 1940. The aviation industry, flush with government contracts, began to experiment with massive airframes and six-engine designs. The strategic philosophy was clear: if the Axis powers ever threatened the Americas, the response would not be an invasion, but a rain of fire from the stratosphere, delivered by fleets of aircraft operating from the safety of American soil. Economically, the pivot created a strange, distorted boom. The loss of European markets was a blow to American agriculture, leading to a depression in the farm belt that required massive federal subsidies. But the manufacturing sector exploded. The War Readiness Act mandated the stockpiling of strategic materials, rubber, tin, manganese, on a scale that dwarfed previous efforts. The federal government began to build shadow factories in the interior of the country, away from the vulnerable coasts. The American economy began to resemble a turtle pulling into its shell, its skin hardening into armour. However, the hemispheric shield had a gaping hole, the Pacific. While the eyes of the public were fixed on the drama of Europe, the strategic vacuum in Asia was widening. The American withdrawal from European affairs sent a dangerous signal to Tokyo. The Imperial Japanese Navy, observing the US turn inward, calculated that the Americans were abandoning their global commitments to save their own skin. The Fortress America doctrine, while reassuring to voters in Ohio, looked like weakness to the planners in Tokyo. The US Navy, now tasked with defending two vast oceans without the assistance of the Royal Navy, found itself overstretched. The Pacific Fleet was moved to Pearl Harbor not as an offensive threat, but as a static guard dog. The logic was that its presence alone would deter aggression. But deterrence relies on the enemy's belief in your willingness to fight. With Roosevelt preaching hemispheric defense, the Japanese leadership began to question whether the US would truly risk war for the sake of the Dutch East Indies or the Philippines. The diplomatic cables between Washington and Tokyo took on a new, darker tone. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, a man of rigid principles, found his leverage evaporating. He could no longer threaten the Japanese with the combined might of the Western democracies, for there were no Western democracies left. He was bluffing with a lone hand. The embargoes on oil and scrap metal, intended to restrain Japan, instead began to look like the desperate measures of a power unwilling to use force. Inside the White House, the black chamber of codebreakers worked tirelessly to decipher the Japanese diplomatic traffic. The intercepts painted a chilling picture. Japan was not deterred, it was emboldened. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was no longer a vague ambition, it was a concrete operational plan. The Japanese saw the British Empire as a rotting carcass, ripe for the picking. They saw the Dutch colonies as orphaned estates, and they saw the United States as a paralysed giant, obsessed with building walls while the world burned. Roosevelt, reading these intercepts late at night in his study, understood the trap he was in. He had promised the American people that their sons would not fight in foreign wars. He had built his political survival on the shield. But he knew that if Japan struck in the Pacific, the shield would be tested not by a European invader, but by an Asian empire seeking to lock the US out of half the world's markets. The tension manifested in a quiet, frantic fortification of the American territories in the Pacific. The Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, received a trickle of reinforcements, modern B-17 bombers and submarines. But it was too little, too late. The Europe First strategy of the original timeline was replaced by a Europe Never, Pacific Maybe confusion. The lack of a clear strategic objective paralysed the military build-up in the East. Was the US defending the Philippines, or was it retreating to the Hawaii-Alaska-Panama line? The ambiguity would prove fatal. By the end of 1940, the United States had transformed. It was no longer a sleeping giant, it was a frightened giant, arming itself with manic intensity, but refusing to step out of its door. The cultural landscape reflected this anxiety. Hollywood movies shifted from light escapism to gritty preparedness dramas. Comic books featured heroes fighting saboteurs on American soil, not Nazis in Berlin. The fear of the fifth column, internal subversion, gripped the FBE. J. Edgar Hoover's power grew unchecked as the hunt for spies, real and imagined, became a national obsession. The Washington pivot also had a profound effect on Latin America. The good neighbor policy was put on steroids. The US used economic coercion and military pressure to align the nations of South America with the hemispheric shield. German airlines operating in Brazil and Argentina were grounded. US bases were established in the Caribbean and Brazil. The Western Hemisphere was being welded into a single strategic bloc, dominated by Washington. It was an empire of necessity, forged in the shadow of the European collapse. As 1941 dawned, the inauguration of Roosevelt for his third term was a sombre affair. There were no parades of military might, for the military was on high alert. The president's speech was a grim reiteration of the new doctrine. "We stand on this continent," he declared, "as the custodians of the flame. The storm rages without, but within these shores the fire shall not die." But the storm was not just raging, it was organizing. In Berlin and Tokyo, the Washington pivot was analyzed not as a show of strength, but as a tacit admission of defeat. The Americans had ceded the old world. They had retreated to their fortress. To the totalitarian minds of the Axis, this was the green light they had been waiting for. The predator does not fear the turtle. It simply ignores it until the shell can be cracked at leisure. The isolation of the United States created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By withdrawing to ensure its safety, it removed the only counterweight that might have prevented the total domination of Eurasia by the Axis powers. The Atlantic was wide, but the world was round. The hemispheric shield was a formidable defence, but it was also a blindfold. And while America built its walls, the Japanese carriers were already practicing their torpedo runs in the secluded bays of Kagoshima, preparing to knock on the door of the fortress with a sledgehammer. The dawn of May 15th, 1941, broke over the endless flatlands of the Polish-Soviet frontier with a deceptive pastoral beauty. The mist clung to the marshes of the Pripyat and the banks of the Bug River, shrouding the greatest concentration of military violence in human history. In the original timeline, Operation Barbarossa was a gamble, a strike launched late in the season, with a Wehrmacht dangerously stretched by the need to garrison a rebellious Western Europe and bail out a faltering Italian ally in the Balkans. But in this timeline, the strategic calculus had been fundamentally altered. The Balkans had been cowed into submission through diplomacy and intimidation, with no British presence in Greece to galvanise resistance. The West was a silent fortress, its industries humming for the Reich. The result was that the German High Command did not have to choose between security and aggression. They chose total aggression. At 3:15 Central European time, the silence was shattered not by a signal shot, but by a continental eruption. The artillery barrage that opened the invasion was of a magnitude that defied previous military experience. It was not merely the fire of German batteries, it was the combined ballistic fury of a conquered Europe. French 155mm howitzers, Czechoslovakian siege guns, and heavy mortars looted from the Dutch arsenals joined the chorus of the Krupp cannons. The logistical spine of this bombardment was the Continental system. The shells raining down on the Red Army positions had been manufactured in Lyon, Liège and Pilsen, transported on the rationalised rail network that Fritz Todt had perfected. There was no rationing of ammunition. The gunners were ordered to fire until their barrels glowed red, for the stockpiles behind them were inexhaustible. Simultaneously, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Wotan, the aerial component of the invasion. In this timeline, the German air fleets were at their absolute zenith. They had not been bled white over the skies of Kent and Sussex. The elite fighter wings, the JG-26 and JG-54, were fully intact. Their pilots rested and flying the latest Messerschmitt variants. There were no Spitfires to contest them. As a result, the Luftwaffe did not just achieve air superiority. They achieved air supremacy within the first 60 minutes. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, was caught on the ground. Its planes lined up in neat rows at forward airfields. The destruction was absolute. By noon on the first day, over 4,000 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed, mostly without ever turning a propeller. The sky belonged entirely to the swarms of Stuka dive bombers, which acted as flying artillery for the advancing armour, operating with an impunity that terrified the Soviet ground troops. On the ground, the difference between this invasion and the historical one was measured in steel and density. The invasion force consisted of over 4.5 million men, organised into 190 divisions. Crucially, this included the 20 elite divisions that, in another history, would have been guarding the French coast against a British raid. It also included a massive reserve of motorised infantry and panzer grenadiers that gave the attack a relentless hydraulic pressure. The attack was organised into 3 colossal army groups, north, centre, and south. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was transformed into a super formation, possessing not 2, but 4 panzer groups. Leading this spearhead was General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Dunkirk victory. His reputation as the breaker of lines was now legendary. His Panzer Group 2, reinforced with the divisions freed from the west, did not pause at the border defences. They smashed through them with a violence that paralysed the Soviet command and control infrastructure. The Red Army was not a hollow force. It was vast and heavily armed, possessing more tanks than the Germans. But it was a giant that had been blinded and deafened before it could throw a punch. The Soviet communications network, dependent on telephone lines, was severed by German special forces and aerial bombardment in the first hour. Commanders in the forward bunkers found themselves shouting into dead phones, while their positions were bypassed and enveloped. The tactical doctrine of the Kesselschlacht, the Cauldron Battle, was executed with geometric perfection. In the historical timeline, the German pincers often struggled to close due to a lack of infantry to seal the pockets. Here, the extra infantry divisions from the west filled the gaps. The first great encirclements at Bialystok and Minsk were not porous traps that allowed thousands of Soviets to escape into the forests. They were steel cages. By the end of May, the German pincers had snapped shut around nearly 700,000 Soviet troops west of Minsk. The scale of the capture was so immense that it created a logistical crisis of its own. Processing the prisoners slowed the advance of the infantry, though the panzers, untethered, raced on. In the Kremlin, the atmosphere was one of catatonic shock. Joseph Stalin had convinced himself that Hitler would not attack without first defeating Britain. The logic was sound, based on the history of warfare, but the premise was flawed because Britain had effectively been defeated. The warning signs had been there, the build-up, the overflights, but Stalin had dismissed them as British provocations designed to drag him into a war he wasn't ready for. Now, with the reports of the frontier collapsing, the reality of his isolation hit him. There was no Winston Churchill sending cables of support. There was no prospect of a second front in the West. The British were neutralized, and the Americans were hiding behind their ocean. The Soviet Union was facing the full industrial and military might of the European continent alone. For the first week, Stalin retreated to his dacha, paralyzed by a nervous collapse, leaving the Stavka, high command, leaderless at the critical moment. Orders were contradictory or non-existent. Stand and fight. Directives were issued to units that had already been annihilated. Counterattacks were launched by brave but uncoordinated tank corps, driving T-34 seconds and KV-1 second blindly into well-laid German anti-tank screens where they were picked off by the 88mm flat guns that had become the scourge of Allied armour. The geographical pace of the advance was dizzying. By mid-June, the Wehrmacht had crossed the Berezina and Dnieper rivers. The city of Smolensk, the traditional key to Moscow, which historically held out until late summer, fell on June 20th. The Luftwaffe, having no other commitments, could concentrate thousands of transport aircraft to fly fuel and ammunition directly to the spearheads. The logistical pauses that usually plagued the German advance were shortened. The panzer divisions did not run out of gas. They were refueled by a supply chain that stretched back to the peaceful, working refineries of Romania and Galicia. The psychological impact on the Soviet population was devastating. The speed of the German advance meant that the scorched earth policy could not be fully implemented. Factories in the Western Soviet Union, which should have been dismantled and moved east to the Urals, were instead captured intact. Rolling stock, grain elevators, and fuel depots fell into German hands, turning the resources of the Ukraine against its defenders. The Wehrmacht was not just conquering territory, it was eating the Soviet logistical tail as it advanced. As July approached, the German vanguard stood on the chaotic approaches to the Valdai Hills and the highway to Moscow. They were weeks ahead of the historical schedule. The weather was hot and dry, turning the dirt roads into clouds of dust that marked the progress of the invader for miles. There was no general mud to save the Red Army yet. The general winter was months away. However, the friction of war began to manifest in different ways. The sheer vastness of the theatre began to dilute the density of the German forces. Even with the extra divisions, the front line was expanding from 800 miles to over 1,000. 500 miles as they pushed east. The partisan war began to ignite behind the lines, not yet the organized force it would become, but a savage, spontaneous resistance by cut-off Red Army units and desperate civilians. The brutality of the ideological war revealed itself immediately. The Halt Order was carried out with ruthless efficiency. Behind the clean lines of the panzers came the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads whose mission was the extermination of the political and racial enemies of the Reich. This was not a war of conquest. It was a war of annihilation, but militarily, the momentum was undeniable. On July 10th, Guderian scouts reported seeing the golden domes of the Kremlin through their high-powered binoculars, a claim that was likely an exaggeration born of adrenaline, but indicative of the proximity. The Red Army was not just retreating, it was dissolving. The levees raised in Moscow, factory workers with rifles, women digging anti-tank ditches were the last line of defense. The professional army had been destroyed in the border battles. In Washington, the reports from the US Embassy in Moscow were grim. The Soviet Union is collapsing, the cables read. The German advance is unchecked. We expect the fall of the capital within the month. This reinforced the isolationist narrative. Why send lend-lease aid to a dying state? Why throw good money after bad? The decision was made to withhold heavy equipment, further dooming the Soviet defense. As Chapter 7 closes, the German Army Group Center is poised for the final lunge. The Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, is not a desperate winter gamble launched in snow, but a summer offensive launched in the high heat of July. The dust hangs heavy over the tear-shaped cupolas of the Russian Orthodox churches, and the roar of the engines drowns out the bells. The bear has been mauled, and the hunter is closing in for the kill, unaware that the wounded animal is most dangerous when it has nowhere left to retreat. The Battle of Moscow, fought in the dusty, scorching heat of August 1941, was not the desperate, frozen miracle of the historical timeline. It was a systematic, industrial demolition. In the original history, the Wehrmacht arrived at the gates of the Soviet capital exhausted, freezing, and running on the fumes of a broken supply chain. In this timeline, the German Army Group Center arrived with full fuel tanks, summer uniforms, and the undivided support of the entire Luftwaffe. The result was a siege that resembled the reduction of Warsaw more than the battles of 1942. The romantic notion of General Winter never arrived to save the defenders. Instead, they were defeated by General Logistics. The assault began on August 15th, designated Operation Typhoon. The name was apt. The German air fleet, commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, established a box of steel over the city. With no British RAF to draw off fighter squadrons to the west, the Luftwaffe concentrated over 2,500 aircraft on the Moscow sector alone. The aerial bombardment was relentless and uncontested. The Soviet anti-aircraft defences, formidable on paper, were overwhelmed by the sheer density of the attack. Wave after wave of Heinkel 111 seconds and Junkers 88 seconds pounded the city's infrastructure, the power plants, the water pumping stations, and, crucially, the rail junctions. Moscow was the central knot of the Soviet spiderweb. By severing the rail lines, the Luftwaffe effectively decapitated the Soviet Union's ability to move men and material between the northern and southern fronts. On the ground, the defense of the city fell to a disorganized amalgamation of shattered regular units, NKVD internal troops, and the Opolchenie, the People's Militia. These factory workers, students, and old men marched out to the suburbs with rifles and Molotov cocktails, digging vast networks of anti-tank ditches. Their bravery was absolute, a testament to the Russian spirit, but bravery is a poor shield against combined arms warfare. They did not rush their tanks into the narrow streets to be ambushed. Instead, they used massive artillery concentrations to pulverize a district, sent in combat engineer battalions equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear the ruins, and only then advanced the infantry. General Georgy Zhukov, recalled from the general staff to organize the defense, found himself playing a game of chess with no pieces. He had no strategic reserve. The Siberian divisions, which historically arrived in the nick of time in December, were still in transit, crawling along the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was now being interdicted by long-range German bombers operating from forward bases in Smolensk. Zhukov's orders to hold to the last man were carried out, but the last man was dying far too quickly. The encirclement of the city was completed on August 28th. The 2nd Panzer Group under Guderian swung from the south, while the 3rd Panzer Group under Hoth clamped down from the north. Meeting at the town of Nojinsk, 30 miles east of the Kremlin, the Moscow pocket was formed. Inside, 2 million civilians and 500,000 soldiers were trapped. The panic that ensued, the Great Moscow Panic, was not the brief, checked event of history. The NKVD, realizing the end was near, began burning archives in the courtyards of the Lubyanka. Ash rained down on the streets like grey snow. Joseph Stalin remained in the Kremlin until the very end of August. His behavior during these final days was manic, vacillating between catatonic silence and explosive rage. He ordered the execution of generals for cowardice, further paralyzing the chain of command. It was only when German artillery shells began to fall within the Kremlin walls that the decision to evacuate was forced upon him by his inner circle. On the night of August 30th, an armoured train, stripped of markings and heavily guarded by Beria's troops, departed from the Kazansky station, heading east toward Kuybyshev. The departure of the Vojdi, the leader, was the signal that the city was lost. The final assault on the city centre began on September 1st. It was a brutal, close-quarters affair. The Moscow metro, the pride of the Soviet state with its marble stations and chandeliers, became the last redoubt. Thousands of civilians and soldiers huddled in the tunnels, living in a subterranean nightmare as fighting raged at the station entrances. The Germans, wary of the tunnels, simply sealed many of the ventilation shafts and entrances with explosives, entombing the defenders alive or forcing them to surrender as the air ran out. By September 5th, German infantry from the Grossdeutschland regiment reached Red Square. The imagery was stark. Swastika flags draped over the blackened onion domes of street. Basil's Cathedral, half-tracks parked on the cobblestones where the May Day parades had marched only months before. The Spasskaya Tower, the iconic clock tower of the Kremlin, had its red ruby star shot out by a tank gunner, leaving a jagged hole against the sky. The silence that fell over the city was heavy, broken only by the crack of execution squads, mopping up the last pockets of resistance. However, the fall of Moscow did not signal the end of the war, but rather its mutation. The bedrock truth of the timeline, the fragmentation of the East, began to manifest immediately. With the central rail hub in German hands, the Soviet Union effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The armies fighting in Leningrad to the north were cut off from the armies fighting in the Ukraine to the south. Communication lines were severed. The centralized command structure, which relied on Moscow as the brain, suffered a massive stroke. In the vast emptiness beyond the Volga, the Soviet Union fractured into what German intelligence called the warlord states. The legitimate government, re-established in Kuybyshev, Samara, controlled the Urals and the industrial evacuation zones. But its writ no longer ran in the north or the south. In the north, the siege of Leningrad tightened. Without supplies from the south, the city entered a phase of starvation far more rapid and lethal than in the historical timeline. The local commanders, cut off from Stalin, began to operate as independent entities, hoarding supplies and refusing orders that did not suit their immediate survival. In the south, the situation was even more chaotic. Marshal Budyonny, commanding the massive Soviet forces in the Ukraine, found himself isolated. Facing the German army group south, he was forced to retreat toward the Caucasus, abandoning the rich agricultural lands of the Donbass. The Cossack populations, long suppressed by the Bolsheviks, saw the collapse of Moscow as a signal for rebellion. Entire regiments of Soviet cavalry defected, offering their swords to the Germans in exchange for autonomy. The Eastern Front ceased to be a continuous line and dissolved into a series of disconnected, savage wars. For the Germans, the victory was total but paradoxical. They had captured the prize, but they had also inherited a ruin. Moscow was a city of 3 million starving people. The infrastructure was wrecked. The Wehrmacht, designed for conquest, was now faced with the monumental task of occupation and administration. The hunger plan, conceived by Nazi bureaucrats, was implemented by default. There was no food to feed the captive population. The German army appropriated what little stocks remained for themselves. The winter of 1941 to 1942 inches, Moscow would see a famine of medieval proportions. The city became a graveyard, a hollow trophy that consumed German manpower just to guard its perimeter. The strategic consequences rippled outward. Turkey, watching the collapse of its northern neighbour, signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with Germany in October, effectively becoming a neutral pro-Axis partner. This allowed German warships to pass through the Dardanelles, threatening the Soviet Black Sea coast from the sea. Sweden, seeing the writing on the wall, increased its iron ore shipments to the Reich and allowed German troops transit rights to Finland. The new order was consolidating its grip. In London, the fall of Moscow was received with a grim sense of validation for the peace of necessity. If the British had continued to fight, the pundits argued, they would have been unable to save Russia anyway, and would likely have shared its fate. The capture of the Soviet capital was presented in the British press as a tragedy, but also as proof that the decision to exit the war was the only rational choice. The Fortress Britain mentality hardened. The world outside the wall was collapsing. The only safety lay in isolation. In Washington, the shock was profound. The Roosevelt administration had gambled that the Soviet Union could hold out long enough to bleed the Germans. That gamble had failed. The Russian bear was not bleeding. It was dismembered. The intelligence reports arriving at the White House described a geopolitical vacuum, extending from the Vistula to the Urals. The fear was no longer that Germany would lose. The fear was that Germany would incorporate the vast resources of Russia, the oil, the minerals, the grain, into its economy before the United States was ready to fight. This accelerated the American timeline for the hemispheric shield. If Germany controlled the heartland of Eurasia, the theories of geopolitician Halford Mackinder suggested they would control the world. The US military planners began to look at the map of the world not as a battlefield, but as a siege. They needed to secure the perimeter: Greenland, Iceland, the Azores, Brazil. The fall of Moscow turned the American strategic gaze from the preservation of democracy to the preservation of the Western Hemisphere. As the first snows finally began to fall in late October, covering the ruins of Moscow in a white shroud, the German soldiers standing guard on the Kremlin walls looked east. They did not see a defeated enemy surrendering. They saw the endless, grey horizon of the steppe disappearing into the mist. It had moved into the forests, into the mountains of the Urals, into the frozen taiga. The centralized war of divisions and corps was over. The decentralized war of terror, ambush, and attrition had begun. The Wehrmacht had won the campaign, but they had just walked into a trap of geography that no amount of panzers could solve. General Guderian, establishing his headquarters in a requisitioned dacha outside the city, he wrote, "But the body still twitches. It is a strange victory. We are masters of the map, but the map is too large. We have conquered a graveyard, and now we must live in it." The capture of Moscow marked the high water mark of the German conventional military. It was the zenith of the blitzkrieg. But as the engines cooled and the winter set in, the reality of the long stagnation began to take hold. The dynamic war of movement died in the snows of 1941, replaced by a static, grinding occupation of a continent that was too vast to rule and too broken to heal. In the grand strategic calculus of the 20th century, the concept of a power vacuum is rarely a static phenomenon. It is a physical force, a low-pressure system that inevitably draws in the nearest dynamic entity. By the autumn of 1941, the Pacific Basin had become the largest geopolitical void in history. The traditional colonial powers that had policed the region for centuries were either conquered, neutralized, or distracted by their own survival. The French in Indochina were ruled by a collaborationist regime in Vichy, taking orders from Berlin. The Dutch in the East Indies were orphans, their government in exile in London, their homeland occupied by the Wehrmacht. The British, huddled in their fortress island, had stripped their Asian garrisons to the bone to pay the ransom of the peace treaty. The Pax Britannica that had secured the sea lanes from Singapore to Hong Kong was now a memory, replaced by the silence of abandonment. In Tokyo, this vacuum was viewed not with fear, but with a predatory hunger. The Imperial General Headquarters, situated in the sombre, wood-panelled complex in Ichigaya. For years, the Strike North faction, advocating for an attack on the Soviet Union to seize Siberia, had held significant sway. But the events of 1941 had rendered that strategy obsolete. The Soviet Union, shattered by the German hammer blow, was no longer a threat. The resources Japan desperately needed, oil, rubber, tin, and bauxite, were not in the frozen taiga. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a man of bureaucratic precision and razor-sharp focus, presided over the liaison conferences that determined the fate of the East. The intelligence reports were unequivocal. The United States, under the hemispheric shield doctrine, was building a wall, not a sword. But the American embargo on oil, imposed in response to Japan's earlier encroachments in Indochina, was a ticking clock. Tojo and the Naval Command faced a binary choice: accept a humiliating withdrawal and the eventual economic strangulation of the empire, or strike now, while the Western world was prostrate. The decisive factor was the perception of American will. The Japanese analysts interpreted the Washington pivot and the refusal to intervene in Europe not as prudent strategy, but as moral decay. They saw a nation obsessed with comfort and safety, a paper tiger that roared about defense but retreated behind its oceans at the first sign of trouble. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, remained skeptical of American weakness. However, he was a gambler by nature. If war was inevitable, he argued, it must begin with a blow so devastating that it would shatter the American psychological armor before their industrial machine could start. The plan, Operation Z, was approved on the 5th of November, 1941. In the original history, Japan worried about a British naval counterattack from Singapore. In this timeline, the Royal Navy was leashed by the Treaty of Amiens, its heavy units restricted to the Atlantic. Japan did not need to dilute its forces. The Kido Butai, the mobile force of 6 fleet carriers, could sail with a singular purpose: the annihilation of the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The task force departed Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26th, slipping into the grey, storm-tossed emptiness of the North Pacific. They maintained strict radio silence, a ghost fleet moving through the fog. The American listening posts, tuned to the diplomatic frequencies and the expected localized chatter near the Philippines, heard nothing. The vacuum was silent. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, the silence broke. The attack on Pearl Harbor was executed with a tactical ferocity that mirrored the German efficiency in the West. The first wave of 183 aircraft achieved complete surprise. The American battleships, moored in Battleship Row, were sitting ducks, but in this timeline, the targeting priority had been subtly altered. Yamamoto, aware that the US was relying on hemispheric defense and long-range air power, had ordered specific attention to the dry docks, the fuel depots, and the submarine base. The destruction was cataclysmic. The USS Arizona exploded, as it did in all timelines, a martyr to the surprise attack. But the damage went deeper. The oil tank farms, missed in the original history, were set ablaze, sending a plume of black smoke miles into the Hawaiian sky. This logistical strike effectively crippled Pearl Harbor as a forward operating base for months. The US Navy did not just lose ships, it lost the ability to fuel the survivors. The political reaction in Washington was instantaneous and incandescent. The isolationism that had paralyzed the country regarding Europe evaporated in the heat of the burning battleships. But the rage was focused, laser-like, on a single target. President Roosevelt appeared before Congress on December 8th. His voice trembled not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. He asked for a declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. He did not mention Germany. He did not mention Italy. The Day of Infamy was a Pacific event. Here, the timeline diverged most critically from the familiar path. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the news of Pearl Harbor with a calculated indifference. In the original timeline, Hitler inexplicably declared war on the United States a few days later, relieving Roosevelt of the political dilemma of a two-front war. In this timeline, Hitler was guided by the cold logic of the one-front war. He had just secured his Eastern Empire. He had no desire to invite the American giant into the Atlantic. The German Foreign Ministry issued a curt statement. The conflict in the Pacific is a result of American provocation and Japanese sovereignty. The Reich observes strict neutrality. This decision trapped the United States. Roosevelt, despite his personal hatred of the Nazi regime, could not politically justify a declaration of war against a Germany that had not attacked America and was technically at peace with Britain. The American public, whipped into a frenzy of anti-Japanese sentiment, demanded retribution against Tokyo, not Berlin. The Europe First strategy was dead. The war became Japan only. The United States mobilized with a terrifying speed, but the direction of the flow was entirely westward. The troop trains that would have headed to New York and Norfolk headed to San Francisco and Seattle. The Liberty ships laid down in the Kaiser shipyards were not designed for the icy North Atlantic run to Murmansk. They were destined for the vast, sun-baked expanses of the Pacific. The immense resources of the American economy, the arsenal of democracy, were uncorked, but the spout was pointed at the Empire of Japan. While the US reeled and rallied, the Japanese Southern Expeditionary Army moved to fill the vacuum in Southeast Asia. The campaign was a masterpiece of speed and amphibious warfare. The Philippines, defended by General Douglas MacArthur's under-equipped forces, faced the full brunt of the Japanese onslaught. Without the hope of a Europe-first strategy to eventually rescue them, the defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed. The Japanese landings at Lingayen Gulf were opposed, but the Japanese air superiority, achieved by the destruction of the US Far East Air Force on the ground at Clark Field, was decisive. Manila fell on January 2nd, 1942. The American forces retreated to Bataan, beginning a siege that was tragic in its inevitability. Further south, the Japanese centrifugal offensive struck the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial forces, isolated and demoralized, put up a token resistance. The prize was the oil fields of Palembang and Balikpapan. Japanese paratroopers seized the refineries intact before the Dutch could detonate them. With the capture of the Indies, Japan had secured the resources it needed to sustain the war indefinitely. The fuel flowed north to the combined fleet, bypassing the American embargo. The position of the British Empire in this maelstrom was pitiful. Hong Kong, an isolated outpost, was attacked by the Japanese 38th Division on December 8th. But the true humiliation came in Malaya and Singapore. Japan, technically an Axis partner, but operating independently, presented London with an ultimatum: grant transit rights and demilitarize the naval base at Singapore or face war. Lord Halifax, in London, faced a nightmare. To refuse meant war with Japan, a war Britain could not fight. To accept was a final surrender of British sovereignty in Asia. The Fortress Britain mentality prevailed. The government, terrified of losing the few ships they had left, or provoking Germany into reopening the Western conflict, chose a policy of passive non-belligerence. Japanese troops marched through the streets of Singapore City, not as conquerors after a battle, but as security guarantors, protecting the region from American aggression. The Gibraltar of the East fell without a shot being fired in its defense. It was the death knell of the British Empire in Asia, a humiliation far deeper than the surrender of 1,942 inches, the original timeline. The Union Jack still flew, but it flew over Japanese barracks. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific had been transformed. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a reality. The Japanese Empire stretched from the Aleutians to the border of India, from Manchuria to New Guinea. They had achieved their strategic objectives in months, but they had also awakened the sleeping giant. The war had bifurcated into two distinct, hermetically sealed conflicts. In Europe and Russia, a grinding, brutal land war of attrition continued between the German Reich and the Soviet remnants, watched by a neutral, terrified Britain. In the Pacific, a titanic naval and aerial duel began between the United States and Japan. There was no lend-lease to Russia. There were no convoys to Liverpool. There was only the vast blue water, the aircraft carrier, and the island-hopping campaign. The United States, denied a war in Europe, poured its entire national frustration into the Pacific. The intercontinental bomber program was accelerated, but now with a new target, the Japanese home islands. The Manhattan Project, operating in the deserts of New Mexico, continued its slow, secret work, but the scientists knew the destination of the gadget. It was not Berlin, it was Tokyo. As the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor and the oil fires of the East Indies burned, the world realized that the World War was a misnomer. There were two wars, on two sides of the planet. The US Navy, bloodied but unbowed, began to paint its ships in dazzle camouflage, preparing to cross the ocean and retake the world, one atoll at a time. The isolationist shield had failed. The imperial sword had struck, and now the American hammer was being raised. By 1943, the world had not only been partitioned by armies but also by currencies. The map of the globe, once a patchwork of political alliances, had solidified into three distinct, impermeable economic monoliths. The fluid, interconnected global trade system of the pre-war era, which had allowed Argentine beef to reach London tables and American Fords to drive on German autobahns, was dead. In its place stood the Sterling Wall, the Reichsmark bloc, and the Dollar Zone, three fortresses of capital that glared at one another across oceans of mistrust. In London, the architect of this financial bulwark was the aging but iron-willed governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. Working in the deepest vaults of Threadneedle Street, shielded from the daylight of a diminished empire, Norman and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Kingsley Wood, drafted the policies that would define the British survival strategy. They recognised a terrifying truth. Britain could no longer compete. The industrial base of the United Kingdom, bombed in the early war and now starved of European inputs, was inefficient and outdated. If free trade were allowed to resume, the superior industrial output of the German-dominated continent and the mass production capability of the United States would flood the empire with cheap goods, bankrupting British factories and draining the nation's gold reserves in months. To prevent this economic hemorrhage, the National Preservation Government enacted the Imperial Economic Security Act. It was the most radical restructuring of the British economy since the Industrial Revolution. The Act formally established the sterling area, not just as a trading bloc, but as a closed loop. The British pound became a non-convertible currency. It could not be exchanged for US dollars or German marks without the direct, written permission of the Treasury, a permission that was almost never granted. The sterling wall was built on the foundation of imperial preference, taken to its absolute draconian logical conclusion. The colonies and dominions, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the African territories were legally bound to conduct all external trade through London. They were forced to sell their raw materials, wool, gold, rubber, tea, to Britain at fixed imperial standard prices, which were often 20 to 30% below the global market rate. In return, they were required to purchase their manufactured goods machinery, textiles, consumer products exclusively from British factories, often at inflated prices. This system was, in essence, a mechanism for siphoning the wealth of the periphery to support the centre. It turned the empire into a colossal life support machine for the British Isles. In Bombay, the cotton growers found they could no longer sell to the Americans or the Japanese. They had to sell to Manchester, and they had to take whatever price Manchester offered. In Sydney, the Australian government, desperate for heavy tractors for their own agriculture, was forbidden from buying the superior American Caterpillar models. They had to wait for inferior British equivalents, which often arrived months late due to the convoy shortages. The geopolitical friction caused by this policy was immense. The United States, fighting its solitary war in the Pacific, the American State Department, led by Cordell Hull, had always viewed the British Empire's trade barriers as an obstacle to world peace and American prosperity. Now, with the US locked out of nearly a third of the world's markets, the diplomatic language became venomous. American exporters, flush with the capacity of a war economy, but denied the European market by Hitler and the imperial market by Churchill's successors, found themselves with a glut of goods and nowhere to sell them. This economic bifurcation deepened the Great Depression for the non-aligned world. Without the liquidity of the dollar flowing into the empire, and without British pounds being able to purchase American goods, global trade volume collapsed to levels lower than the worst years of the 1,930 seconds. Innovation stagnated. In a competitive global market, companies are forced to innovate to survive. In the closed ecosystem of the Sterling Wall, British companies had a captive audience. There was no need to improve the efficiency of a loom or the design of a car if the customers in Nigeria or Queensland were legally prohibited from buying anything else. The British disease, a mix of complacency, underinvestment, and low productivity, became the defining feature of the imperial economy. Inside the Reichsmark bloc, a similar but more brutal process was underway. The Grossraumwirtschaft was a command economy directed from Berlin. The currencies of France, the Netherlands, and the other occupied nations were pegged to the Reichsmark at artificially low rates, making German goods expensive for the French to buy, but French agricultural produce dirt cheap for Germans to import. It was a system of systematized plunder, hidden behind exchange rates. However, unlike the British system, the German bloc had a massive internal market of 300 million people and a unified resource base. The German economy grew, fed by the looting of the East and the industry of the West. A militarized prosperity that produced guns and synthetic fuel, but little in the way of consumer joy. The friction between these blocs created a breeding ground for smuggling and grey market trading. Lisbon, in neutral Portugal, became the Casablanca of this timeline. It was the only place where the sterling, dollar, and mark spheres overlapped. In the cafes of the Rossio Square, British agents sold South African diamonds to German industrial buyers in exchange for Swedish ball bearings, with the transactions settled in Swiss francs or gold bars. It was a shadow economy, vital for the survival of the warring states, but officially denied by all. The Lisbon fixing became the real indicator of the war's progress. A daily fluctuating exchange rate that told the truth when the newspapers lied. For the common citizen within the Sterling Wall, life became a shade of grey. The austerity that had begun as a wartime necessity became a permanent feature of existence. The utility scheme was introduced in Britain, standardizing the production of furniture, clothing, and household goods. There was utility furniture, sturdy, plain, and devoid of ornament. There were utility suits, cuffless, single-breasted, efficient. It was a society of enforced modesty. The colourful, chaotic variety of the free market was replaced by a limited menu of state-approved options. The strain on the dominions began to show cracks in the imperial unity. Canada, caught in the gravitational pull of the United States but politically tethered to the Sterling Wall, faced an identity crisis. The Canadian dollar was historically linked to the US dollar, but London demanded it be pegged to the pound. This caused massive inflation in Canada and shortages of American goods. In Ottawa, a quiet but powerful movement began to form, advocating for economic sovereignty. They looked south to the booming, dynamic US war economy and asked why they were shackled to the corpse of the British Imperium. In India, the situation was more volatile. The Bengal famine of 1943, a tragedy in our timeline, was exacerbated in this one by the rigid controls of the Sterling Wall. Rice from Burma was cut off by the Japanese occupation, and the alternative sources of grain from the US or Australia were blocked by the currency restrictions and the lack of shipping, which was prioritised for the reparations run to Europe. The British government, terrified of defaulting on the German treaty terms, prioritised the shipment of resources to pay the ransom over the relief of the famine. The resulting starvation in Bengal was not just a humanitarian disaster. It was a silent indictment of the fortress strategy. It planted the seeds of a deep, irrevocable bitterness that would fuel the post-war independence movements with a new, furious intensity. The technological divergence between the blocs became stark. The United States, driven by the demands of the Pacific War and the unbridled capitalism of the hemispheric shield poured billions into petrochemicals, aviation, and electronics. The dollar zone became the center of the world's innovation. In contrast, the sterling area relied on coal, steam, and older mechanical technologies. A British factory in 1943 looked much like it did in 1923. A German factory looked like a prison, efficient but terrifying. An American factory looked like the future. By the end of 1943, the Sterling Wall had succeeded in its primary objective. Britain had not gone bankrupt. The pound held its value, artificially propped up by the labour of the empire. The ransom payments to Germany continued, securing the release of another 120,000 prisoners. But the cost was the ossification of the British spirit. The nation had turned into a giant accounting firm, obsessed with ledgers and quotas. The global economy had entered a dark age of commerce. The seas were empty of merchant ships, except for the heavily guarded convoys. The telegraph cables carried orders, not orders for goods. The dream of a liberal, interconnected world, which had been the ideal of the 19th and early 20th centuries, was dead. In its place was a triad of autarchies: the German barracks, the American foundry, and the British counting house. As the year closed, a secret meeting took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The United States, Brazil, Mexico, and Canada, attending as observers, met to plan the dollar standard. They did not invite the British. They did not invite the Europeans. They began to build the financial architecture of the post-war world on the assumption that Europe and the British Empire were closed systems that would eventually collapse under their own weight. The isolation of the Sterling Wall was no longer just a British policy. It was becoming a global quarantine. In the history of science, the timeline of the atomic bomb is often viewed as a deterministic sprint, a desperate, inevitable race fueled by the existential terror that the enemy might get there first. In the timeline of the One-Front War, however, that terror was absent. The specific geopolitical chemistry that triggered the frantic acceleration of the Manhattan Project, the fear in London and Washington that Adolf Hitler was months away from an atomic superweapon, did not exist. Hitler had won in the West, and he had done so with tanks, dive bombers, and radio coordination. The German High Command saw no need for a theoretical wonder weapon based on what they derisively termed Jewish physics to secure a victory they had already achieved. Consequently, the uranium race of the early 1940 seconds was not a sprint. It was a disjointed, bureaucratic crawl, conducted in the shadows of three mutually suspicious empires, each hindered by its own unique form of blindness. In Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics remained a quiet, academic sanctuary. Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel laureate and the face of German science, sat in his office overlooking the gardens, engaging in leisurely theoretical debates with his colleague Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. There were no air raid sirens to interrupt them. There were no frantic demands from the SS for immediate results. In this timeline, the urgency of the Uhrenverein, Uranium Club. When Heisenberg met with Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, in June 1942, the conversation was radically different from the historical record. In the original timeline, Heisenberg requested vast sums of Reichsmarks and materials, hinting at a bomb but promising a reactor. Here, Speer, flush with the looted resources of Europe and managing a war economy that was running smoothly, asked a simple question: is this weapon necessary to defeat the remaining Soviet warlords or the British garrison state? Heisenberg, a man of equivocation who perhaps subconsciously recoiled from the horror of the bomb, answered honestly, "No, Herr Minister, it is a project for the next generation. The theoretical critical mass is achievable, but the industrial effort required to separate the isotopes would dwarf the production of our panzer divisions." Speer, a technocrat obsessed with efficiency, shelved the bomb project. He authorized funding only for a uranium engine, a nuclear reactor designed to power the next generation of U-boats. The German nuclear program became a naval propulsion project, not a weapons program. It was well-funded, methodical, and utterly unthreatening to the immediate safety of the world. the German physics movement, led by the anti-Semitic Philipp Lenard, further stifled research into quantum mechanics, labeling it as degenerate. Without the pressure of total war, ideological purity trumped scientific pragmatism. The Third Reich walked away from the atomic bomb because it felt too secure to need it. Across the Channel, in the austere, rationed corridors of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, the British scientists, led by James Chadwick and the émigrés Rudolf Peels and Otto Frisch, knew the bomb was possible. They had drafted the MAUD committee report in 1941, outlining the feasibility of a uranium weapon. But knowledge without capacity is a curse. Under the crushing economic weight of the Sterling Wall and the fortress strategy, Britain simply did not have the electricity or the money to build the massive gaseous diffusion plants required to enrich uranium. Historically, Britain handed its secrets to the United States in the Tizard mission, merging tube alloys with the Manhattan Project. But in this timeline, the special relationship was dead, strangled by the trade wars and American isolationism. The Churchill government had fallen. The Halifax government viewed the United States as a predatory commercial rival that had abandoned Europe. There was no Tizard mission. The secrets of the Maud report were classified ultra-secret and locked in a safe in Whitehall. The British government faced a use it or lose it dilemma and chose to bury it. Lord Cherwell, the scientific advisor to the cabinet, argued that sharing the secret with Washington would only hand the Americans the ultimate weapon, which they might use to dominate the post-war world or worse, trade to Germany for influence. "We cannot build it," Cherwell wrote in a grim memo to Halifax, "but we must ensure no one else does. Silence is our only shield." The British nuclear program became a zombie project maintained on paper, staffed by brilliant men who were forbidden from publishing or building, watching their theories gather dust while they worked on improving radar and sonar for the convoy escorts. In the United States, the Manhattan Engineer District was established, but its birth was difficult and delayed. Without the British impetus, the warnings that the Germans are ahead, the American program lacked the catalytic spark of fear. The impetus for the American war effort was the Pacific, and the nature of the Pacific War was naval and amphibious. The immediate demand was for aircraft carriers, long-range B-36 bombers, and incendiary munitions. Vannevar Bush, the head of the US Office of Scientific Research and Development, had to fight tooth and nail for funding. He could not point to a German threat, as Germany was neutral toward the US. He could only argue for the abstract strategic value of the weapon. The Jewish science that the Germans rejected had found a home in America, with Einstein, Szilard, and Fermi pushing for the bomb. But without the backing of the president's inner circle, who were focused entirely on the hemispheric shield and the revenge against Japan, they were marginalized. General Leslie Groves was eventually appointed to lead the project in late 1942, a full year later than in the original timeline. Groves was a builder, a man of concrete and schedules. When he surveyed the landscape, he found a program in disarray. There was no British collaboration, meaning American scientists had to duplicate the work already done by Piles and Frisch. The critical calculations on the cross-section of uranium-235 had to be redone. The time lost was measured in years. Furthermore, the Pacific-only war changed the strategic targeting. The motivation to use an atomic bomb on Berlin, the heart of darkness, was absent. The target was Tokyo, but the racial dynamics of the war against Japan led to a preference for burning them out with conventional firebombs, which were cheaper and available immediately. The urgency to build a single, complex device was lower when the B-29 seconds and B-36 seconds were already turning Japanese cities into ash with napalm. The uranium race thus became a uranium stroll. The massive facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford were built, but the priority level was AA3 rather than the AAA1 of history. Steel and copper were diverted to the shipyard production of the Essex-class carriers. The best electrical engineers were drafted into the radar and proximity fuse programs, which offered immediate tactical advantages against the kamikazes. By 1944, the divergence was clear. In the original timeline, the Los Alamos laboratory was a hive of frantic activity, driving toward a test in July 1945. In this timeline, Los Alamos was a quieter place. Robert Oppenheimer, plagued by security investigations due to his leftist past, which were prosecuted more vigorously by the paranoia of the hemispheric shield state, was removed from the project in 1943. He was replaced by the more conservative, but less inspirational, Nobel laureate Arthur Compton. Compton was a cautious administrator. He focused on the plutonium pathway, dismissing the uranium gun-type design as too risky. This decision, aimed at safety and certainty, added another 18 months to the development timeline. Meanwhile, the Soviet nuclear program, which had been a serious contender in the early 1942 under Igor Kurchatov, had been physically annihilated. The laboratory in Leningrad was under siege and starving. The institute in Kharkov was in German hands. Kurchatov and his team had been evacuated to Kazan, but their equipment had been lost in the rail chaos. They lacked uranium ore, cyclotrons, and graphite. The Soviet Union, fractured into warlord states, dropped out of the race entirely. The spies who had historically funneled secrets to Moscow, Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, found their handlers missing or dead. The intricate web of atomic espionage collapsed because there was no center to receive the intelligence. As 1945 approached, the gadget was still a collection of blueprints and half-finished plutonium slugs cooling in a reactor at Hanford. The US military planned for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, based purely on conventional firepower. They calculated casualties in the millions, unaware that a shortcut had been missed. The impact of this delay on the global psyche was profound. Science retained a Victorian character. It was seen as a tool of industry and gradual improvement, not as a force capable of ending the world in a flash. The apocalyptic anxiety that defined the Cold War was absent. War was still viewed as a contest of production and endurance, a long, bloody grind that could be won if one simply built enough tanks. The concept of mutually assured destruction did not exist. This made the peace more fragile, for without the fear of the bomb, the great powers were less afraid of direct conflict. In Germany, the focus on nuclear propulsion bore fruit. In early 1945, the Kriegsmarine launched the U-2000-501, a Type XXI submarine modified with a primitive uranium engine. It was not a true nuclear reactor in the modern sense, but a steam-generating pile that allowed the boat to stay submerged for weeks. It was a tactical triumph, allowing German submarines to patrol the American security zone undetected. But it was not a strategic game-changer. It could sink ships, but it could not level cities. The uranium race of this timeline demonstrates the fragility of progress. It showed that technological singularity is not inevitable. It requires the convergence of money, fear, and political will. By removing the fear of a Nazi bomb and severing the Anglo-American partnership, the timeline pushed the atomic age back by a decade. The world of 1945 was a world of vast armies and conventional armadas. The skies were filled with bombers, but they carried TNT and jellied gasoline. The shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not fall across history. Instead, the shadow was a long, unbroken twilight of conventional industrial warfare, where death was dealt retail, not wholesale. The atom remained locked in its shell, and the gods of war were forced to continue their work with iron and fire. By 1944, the map of the Third Reich stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the jagged, pine-covered spine of the Ural Mountains. On paper, this was the realization of the ultimate geopolitical fantasy, the acquisition of Lebensraum, the vast living space that Adolf Hitler had promised would secure the existence of the German people for 1,000 years. The cartographers in Berlin drew the border with a thick, confident black line, designating everything west of the peaks as Reichskommissariat Moskowien, a civilized province of the New Order. But maps are silent on the subject of friction. In reality, the Urals were not a border, they were an open, festering wound that refused to close. The German advance had stalled in late 1942, not because of a specific military defeat, but because of the sheer, crushing physics of distance. The logistical umbilical cord, stretching over 2,000 miles from the factories of the Ruhr to the forward bunkers in Magnitogorsk, had snapped under its own weight. The Wehrmacht, unbeaten in the field but exhausted by the endless horizon, they established the Ostwall East Wall, a defensive fortification line that dwarfed the Maginot Line in length, if not in sophistication. It was not a continuous ribbon of concrete, but a deep, militarized zone of strongpoints, minefields, wire, and electronic surveillance stations running north to south along the mountain range. To the east of this line lay the remnants of the Soviet Union, a chaotic archipelago of warlord states centered around the industrial cities of the Kuzbass and the administrative capital of Kubyshev. The centralized authority of the Communist Party had fractured. In its place arose a new breed of leadership. The front commanders, men like Rodion Malinovsky and Ivan Konev, who operated as independent viceroys. They commanded ragtag armies of survivors, refugees, and fanatical partisans. They had no hope of reconquering Moscow in a conventional offensive, so they adopted a strategy of eternal harassment. The Urals line thus became the setting for a gruesome, silent war of attrition that defined the mid-1942. It was a sniper's war, a saboteur's war. There were no grand maneuvers of panzer divisions. For the terrain of the Urals, dense taiga, steep ravines, and freezing passes negated the German advantage in mobile warfare. Instead, it was a war of small unit actions. German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, the elite of the new frontier, patrolled the white silence on skis, hunting for Soviet infiltration teams. The reality of the occupation behind the lines was a stark contrast to the utopian propaganda films being shown in Berlin cinemas. The Nazi vision of the East involved the settlement of millions of German farmers, the Wehrbauer or soldier peasants, who would cultivate the black soil of the Ukraine and Russia while standing guard over the subject races. The SS had drawn up elaborate plans for model villages connected by high-speed autobahns, a Teutonic garden stretching to the horizon, but the settlers did not come. Or rather, they came, looked at the reality, and fled. The fields were worked by forced labourers who watched their masters with sullen hatred, waiting for the cover of night to sabotage the tractors or burn the barns. The Green Partisans' nationalist guerrillas who fought both the Germans and the Soviet remnants roamed the forests of Belarus and western Ukraine, making travel between cities impossible without an armoured escort. The dream of a pastoral paradise collapsed into a reality of armed camps. The German administrators lived in the cities, behind barbed wire and machine gun nests, venturing out only in convoys. The countryside belonged to the night. This forever war began to warp the German economy. The plunder of the conquered territories was immense, but the cost of securing it was rising exponentially. The Continental system was efficient at extracting resources, but those resources were immediately consumed by the voracious appetite of the Ostwall. The millions of tons of grain from the Ukraine were not feeding German civilians. They were feeding the 3 million soldiers stationed in the east to guard the grain. It was a closed loop of futility. The Reich was fighting to hold the territory it needed to sustain the fight to hold the territory. To maintain the stalemate, the German military-industrial complex was forced to innovate in the realm of counterinsurgency. The Flettner FL-282 Colibri, one of the world's first operational military helicopters, became the symbol of the frontier. These small buzzing machines operated from forward bases in the Urals, acting as spotters for the artillery and as rapid transport for the jagged commandos, hunting teams. They hovered over the ravines, their twin intermeshing rotors chopping the thin mountain air, searching for the heat signatures of partisan campfires. On the ground, the German army began to rely heavily on auxiliary police battalions, recruited from the local populations, Ukrainians, Balts, and anti-communist Russians. These units, led by German officers, were unleashed with a terrifying lack of restraint. The atrocities committed in the name of security in the villages of the Urals frontier were systematic. The bandit fighting decree allowed for the burning of entire districts if partisan activity was detected. The smoke of burning villages became a permanent feature of the eastern horizon, a grim signal fire that the war was not over. For the average German citizen, the Urals line became a source of deep, unspoken anxiety. The victory over Russia had been announced in 1941, yet the casualty lists continued to appear in the local papers every week. Fallen for the Führer in the East became a standard obituary line, but there was no major battle to explain the deaths. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a son killed by a sniper while repairing a telephone line, a husband lost when his truck hit a mine near Perm, a brother who simply vanished on patrol. The East sickness began to infect the returning veterans. Men came back from their tours on the Ostwall changed. They were not the triumphant heroes of the Blitzkrieg era. They were hollow-eyed, jumpy, and silent. They brought back stories they only whispered in the safety of their kitchens, stories of the cold, the cruelty. The regime tried to suppress this, creating a narrative of the sentinel on the mountain. But the truth seeped through. The East was not a garden, it was a grave. This stagnation had profound political consequences. The socialist part of National Socialism, the promise of a classless society with high living standards for all Germans, was indefinitely postponed. The resources that were supposed to build the Volkswagen for every worker and the holiday resorts on Rügen were diverted to the production of half-tracks and winter clothing. Rationing in Germany, which had been alleviated by the initial plunder, tightened again. The guns or butter debate was settled definitively in favour of guns. Furthermore, the warlord states to the east were proving to be surprisingly resilient. The government in Kuibychev, though stripped of its legitimacy and its capital, had managed to stabilize the industrial base in the Urals and Siberia. They received no help from the West, but they had the advantage of strategic depth. They developed a doctrine of technological asymmetry. Lacking the capacity to build thousands of tanks to challenge the Germans, they focused on cheap, effective weapons, landmines, sniper rifles, and primitive rockets. They became the Viet Cong of the steppes, a force that could not win but refused to die. The friction also ground down the German demographic profile. The War of Annihilation had decimated a generation of young German men. Now, the occupation was consuming the next cohort. The draft age was lowered to 17, then 16. The Hitler Jugend were no longer just marching in parades. They were being trained for frontier duty. The demographic crisis that would haunt Germany for decades was being manufactured in the bunkers of the Urals. By 1945, the situation had crystallized into a permanent, bloody status quo. The border was static. The Germans held the line, their high-tech surveillance posts overlooking the desolate valleys. The Soviets held the interior, their partisan bands moving like ghosts through the trees. The psychological toll on the Nazi leadership was also visible. Heinrich Himmler, whose SS was responsible for the administration of the East, became increasingly obsessed with the occult and the esoteric, seeking mystical solutions to the logistical nightmare. He commissioned the construction of Wewelsburg Castle as the spiritual center of the SS, while his subordinates struggled to keep the trains running through partisan-infested forests. The master race was finding that ruling the world was a burden of crushing weight. In the captured cities like Moscow and Leningrad, the German occupation authorities ruled over a necropolis. The populations had been reduced by starvation and deportation to a fraction of their pre-war levels. Those who remained were slave labourers, maintaining the infrastructure for their conquerors. The German plans to rebuild Moscow as Germanicopolis were abandoned. The ruins were simply bulldozed to create fire breaks and security zones. The onion domes were gone, replaced by the stark, concrete architecture of the organization Tot. As the snow melted in the spring of 1945, marking the 4th year of the occupation, a German sentry stood on a watchtower overlooking a valley near Ufa. Through his infrared scope, a new technology rushed to the front. He watched a herd of deer moving at the forest edge. For a moment, he relaxed. Then, a single crack echoed off the canyon walls. The sentry slumped forward. The deer scattered. The report filed that evening simply stated, Sector 4, quiet. 1 casualty. It was the lie that held the Reich together. The Urals line was the bleeding edge of an empire that had expanded until it hit the hard limit of reality. Germany had conquered the space, but it could not conquer the people, nor the geography. The metamorphosis was complete. The predator had become the prey, trapped in a cage of its own making, forced to stand guard forever over a victory that felt increasingly like a sentence. By the middle of the decade, the smoke over Europe had cleared, but the sun did not return. In the historical timeline, 1945 was the year of liberation, of the breaking of the camps, of the jubilant crowds in Paris, and the smoking ruins of the Reich Chancellery. In the timeline of the One-Front War, 1945 was the year the concrete hardened. The grey peace had settled over the continent like a layer of heavy, wet ash. It was not a piece of treaties or handshakes, but a piece of exhaustion, resignation, and the terrified silence of a population that had realized no one was coming to save them. The physical landscape of Western Europe had been spared the apocalyptic destruction of the late-war aerial bombing campaigns. The great medieval centres of Nuremberg, Dresden, and Cologne remained intact, their spires piercing the sky rather than lying in rubble. But this preservation came at the cost of their souls. The cities were clean, the trams ran on time, and the rubble from the 1940 invasion had long since been swept away. To an observer from a high altitude, Europe looked ordered, efficient, and peaceful. It was only on the ground that the suffocation became palpable. The primary instrument of this new order was not the Gestapo agent on the corner, though he was certainly there. It was the bureaucrat. The European Administrative Commission, headquartered in a sprawling neoclassical complex in Brussels. Its mandate was the harmonization of the European space. In practice, this meant the systematic dismantling of national identities and their replacement with a generic, sanitized Euro-Germanic culture. The transformation was most visible in the schools. The Education Decree of 1943 had standardized the curriculum across the occupied territories. In a classroom in Lyon, French children did not start their day with La Marseillaise. They started with a salute to the portrait of the Führer, followed by a lesson in racial science and European history. The history books had been rewritten with Orwellian efficiency. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was taught as a tragic civil war incited by British plutocrats and Jewish agitators. The current conflict was framed as the War of Unification, a noble crusade where Germany had stepped in to save Europe from the twin threats of Bolshevik barbarism and American cultural degeneracy. German became the mandatory second language, the lingua franca of commerce and advancement. To get a job in the civil service, to attend a university, or to manage a factory, one had to speak the language of the master. The streets of Paris, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen began to change their skin. Street signs were bilingual. The grand boulevards were renamed. The Place de la Concorde remained, but the Champs-Élysées was frequently adorned with the banners of the European Brotherhood. The swastika intertwined with the national flags of the vassal states, a visual lie of partnership. Culturally, the continent underwent a forced sterilization. The Reich Chamber of Culture extended its tentacles into every theatre, gallery, and cinema. Degenerate art, cubism, surrealism. Jazz was not just banned, it was treated as a mental illness. The galleries were filled with heroic realism, endless variations of muscular men looking at horizons and women with braided hair nursing healthy children. It was art without conflict, without question, and without life. Cinema became the most powerful tool of the Grey Peace. The UFA studios in Babelsberg, now the undisputed capital of European film, churned out high-production historical epics and musicals. These films were technically brilliant, utilizing the Agfacolor process to create lush, vibrant worlds that distracted the populace from the drab reality of their lives. They depicted a mythical, harmonious Europe, a fortress of culture standing against the soulless materialism of the United States. In a world without political freedom, the dark room and the flickering screen were the only authorized escape. For the average citizen, life was defined by the caloric compromise. There was no starvation in the West that was reserved for the East, but there was no luxury. The rationing system was permanent. The diet was heavy on potatoes, cabbage, and synthetic fats. The Volkswagen, promised to the German worker, finally began to appear on the roads, but it was restricted to party members and essential workers. For the French or the Dutch, the bicycle remained the primary mode of transport. The silence of the cities, devoid of heavy traffic, contributed to the eerie, museum-like atmosphere of the occupation. The social structure of the occupation had matured into a rigid caste system. At the top were the Reichsdeutsche Imperial Germans, who moved through the occupied capitals with the confident air of owners. They lived in the best requisitioned apartments, shopped in special stores, and ate in German-only restaurants. Below them were the Volksdeutsche and the collaborators, the Vichy officials, the Dutch members of the NSB, the Belgian Rexists. These were the enforcers, the local elites who had tied their fortunes to the German victory. They were despised by their neighbours, but feared for their connections. At the bottom were the non-politicals, the vast majority who kept their heads down, went to work, and tried to survive. The spirit of resistance that had flickered in 1940 and 1941 had largely been extinguished by the normalcy. In the historical timeline, the hope of D-Day kept the fire alive. Here, there was no hope of D-Day. The Atlantic Wall was finished, an impregnable belt of concrete. The Americans were fighting in the Pacific. The British were locked in their cage. The realization that this is it, this is how it will be for the rest of our lives, bred a paralyzing apathy. Resistance became seen not as heroism, but as madness, a selfish act that would only bring down reprisals on one's family. The surveillance state had evolved. It was no longer reliant solely on the leather-coated Gestapo agent kicking down doors. It was a surveillance of paperwork. The workbook, Arbeitsbuch, was essential for existence. Without it, one could not get rations, housing, or medical care. Every movement, every job change, every address was recorded in the central registries. To be undocumented was to be a ghost, slowly starving in the cracks of the system. The block warden system was exported to France and the Low Countries. In every apartment building, a designated loyalist watched the comings and goings of the tenants, reporting any anti-European behaviour to the local police. Trust evaporated. People stopped talking in cafes. Conversations were restricted to the weather and the ration quotas. Yet, underneath this grey blanket, the final solution continued with a terrifying... In the original timeline, the Holocaust was a chaotic, accelerated industrial slaughter driven partly by the panic of military defeat. In this timeline, without the pressure of approaching Allied armies, the genocide was slower but even more thorough. It was not an explosion of violence. It was a civil engineering project. The resettlement of the Jewish populations of Western Europe was completed by 1945. They had been moved east to the industrial zones in Poland and the Ukraine. The reality of their fate was an open secret. The trains left at night. The apartments became vacant and were quickly filled by bombed-out German families or deserving collaborators. Everyone knew they were not coming back, but no one spoke of it. To speak of it was to question the state, and to question the state was to join them on the trains. The moral corruption of the Grey Peace was total. The entire continent was complicit in a conspiracy of silence. The smoke from the east was dismissed as industrial exhaust, a convenient lie that allowed the French baker and the Dutch clerk to sleep at night. In the realm of leisure, the Nazi organization, Strength Through Joy, KDF, expanded its operations. German families spent their summers on the beaches of Normandy, walking on the sands where, in another world, American blood would have been spilled. They took tours of the battlefields of 1940, listening to guides describe the glorious victory over the British. The Riviera became a playground for the SS elite and the top industrialists, a zone of decadence where champagne still flowed and the war seemed a million miles away. Across the Channel, the view from Britain was one of alienation and despair. The channel of silence had widened into a cultural abyss. The British, living their austere, monochrome existence behind the Sterling Wall, looked at the propaganda reels of a united Europe with a mixture of envy and revulsion. They saw the lights on in Paris, even if they were dim, the concerts in Berlin, the seeming stability. The British press, censored and controlled, tried to paint the continent as a prison, but the letters from the few Red Cross workers allowed through told a more complex story. They told of a Europe that was working, a Europe that was forgetting the old ways. The intellectual life of Britain turned inward, becoming defensive and nostalgic. While Europe was being force-fed a new, artificial future, Britain clung to its past. The literature of the period was obsessed with the Victorian era, a time when Britain ruled the world. It was a psychological retreat from a present where they were irrelevant. The angry young men were not just angry at the class system. They were angry at the cage. They were angry that the grand narrative of liberty had ended in a stalemate. In Berlin, Albert Speer's Germania project began to take physical form. The victory having been secured, despite the bleeding ulcer in the Urals, Hitler demanded the realization of his architectural dreams. The Great Hall, the Volkshalle, was not yet finished, but the massive north-south axis boulevard was under construction. Whole districts of Old Berlin were demolished to make way for the Avenue of the Giants. The dust of construction hung over the capital, mixing with the smog of the industry. It was a city being built for titans, completely out of scale with the human beings who lived in it. The architecture was meant to intimidate, to make the individual feel small and the state feel eternal. As the winter of 1945 turned into the spring of 1946, the grey peace seemed unshakable. There were no riots. There were no strikes. The radio played Wagner and Lehar. The trains moved east with troops and west with grain. The children in the schools of Amsterdam recited their lessons in German, forgetting the Dutch words for freedom and democracy. The metamorphosis was not just political, it was cognitive. The people of Europe were forgetting that there had ever been another way to live. The anomaly was becoming the baseline. The generation coming of age, the Hitler Youth generation, knew nothing else. To them, the swastika was not a symbol of occupation. It was just the flag. The new order was not new anymore. It was just the order. The horror of the grey peace was not in the torture chambers, which were hidden deep underground, but in the surface-level tranquility. It was the horror of a society that had functioned, adapted, and accepted the unacceptable. It was the banality of a world where the bad guys had won, and the sun continued to rise, indifferent to the moral catastrophe below. The winter of 1,949 inches, Berlin was the coldest in living memory. The wind swept down from the Baltic, howling through the unfinished canyons of the north-south axis, the monumental boulevard that Albert Speer had carved through the heart of the city. The construction cranes, frosted with ice, stood like dormant sentinels over the skeletal dome of the Volkshalle, the Great Hall of the People. It was meant to be the crowning jewel of the Thousand-Year Reich, a structure so vast it would have its own weather system. But like the regime itself, the hall was stalled, a grandiose shell of concrete and steel, waiting for resources that were constantly being diverted to the bleeding frontier of the Urals. Inside the new Reich Chancellery, the atmosphere was hermetically sealed. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, had not been seen in public for nearly 18 months. The official newsreels showed recycled footage from the mid-42nds, dubbed with reassuring narration about his tireless work for the European peace. The man who had reshaped the world was a trembling, pharmaceutical husk, sequestered in his private apartments, his mind eroding under the onset of Parkinson's disease and the toxic cocktail of drugs administered by his physician. The state had entered a period of zombie governance. The Führer principle, the bedrock of National Socialist law which dictated that all authority flowed from the leader's will, had become a recipe for paralysis. Without a clear directive from the top, the massive bureaucracy of the empire froze. Decisions on grain allocation, troop rotations, and industrial quotas piled up in the in-trays of terrified ministers who dared not act without approval, yet could not get access to the man who gave it. The silence at the top created a vacuum that drew in the sharks. The succession crisis did not begin with a bang. It began with the quiet scratching of pens and the whispering of encrypted telephone calls. Three distinct centers of gravity emerged in the gloom of the twilight regime, each eyeing the others with murderous intent. The first was the party machine, controlled by Martin Bormann. As the Führer's private secretary, Bormann controlled the physical access to Hitler. He was the gatekeeper, the brown eminence. He held the rubber stamp that could move armies or liquidate cities. Bormann had no charisma, but he had the files. He knew every scandal, every embezzlement, every secret weakness of the Gauleiters and ministers. His power base was the NSDAP bureaucracy itself, a vast network of spies and functionaries who owed their jobs to his patronage. The second faction was the Black Corps, the SS state within a state led by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. From his fortress at Wilsberg, Himmler commanded the police, the Gestapo, and the Waffen SS divisions that were not committed to the East. Himmler was increasingly detached from reality, obsessed with the occult and the Aryanization of the East. But his fanatical legions were the most lethal force in the Reich. He viewed himself as the spiritual successor, the high priest who would cleanse the empire of the moderates and materialists. The third faction was the military-industrial complex, a pragmatic alliance between Reich Marshal Hermann Göring and Armaments Minister Albert Speer. Göring, nominally the designated successor, was a physical wreck, bloated and addicted to morphine, but he retained the loyalty of the Luftwaffe and the old Prussian aristocracy. Speer, the technocrat, realized that Bormann's corruption and Himmler's mysticism would destroy the economy. He saw Göring as a useful figurehead, a recognized hero who could be managed while the technocrats ran the machine. The tension snapped on the night of the 20th of January 1950. At 3:42 a.m., Adolf Hitler died of a massive stroke in his sleep. The event that should have triggered national mourning instead triggered a total information blackout. Bormann, who was present in the Chancellery, immediately ordered the telephone lines cut. He activated Operation Valhalla, a contingency plan designed to secure the government district. But in a totalitarian state, secrets have a half-life of minutes. A sympathetic nurse in the Chancellery tipped off an SS contact. Within the hour, the teletype machines at Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse were chattering. Berlin became a chessboard in the dark. As dawn broke, the citizens of the capital noticed that the Grossdeutschland Guard Regiment had deployed armoured cars to the intersections around the government quarter. The radio stations went off the air, replaced by a continuous loop of Wagner's Gotterdammerung. There was no announcement, but the silence was deafening. Every Berliner knew what it meant. The king was dead. The week of long knives had begun. It was not a civil war fought with artillery in the streets, but a shadow war of arrests, assassinations, and standoffs. Bormann made the first move, issuing a communiqué under Hitler's forged signature, stripping Himmler of his titles for treason against the state and ordering his arrest. But the order never reached the police precincts. Himmler struck back. Squads of SD commandos attempted to storm the Ministry of Armaments to arrest Speer, whom Himmler viewed as a traitor to the racial struggle. They were met by Luftwaffe field division troops loyal to Göring, who had fortified the building. A firefight erupted in the Wilhelmstrasse German soldiers, killing German soldiers under the indifferent gaze of the Stone Eagles. The news of the skirmish spread like wildfire. The facade of unity, carefully maintained for 17 years, shattered. In the capitals of the occupied territories, the paralysis in Berlin was felt like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. In Paris, the German military governor, General von Choltitz, received conflicting orders. One from Himmler, ordering the execution of political prisoners, one from Göring ordering a general alert against an SS coup. Choltitz, a professional soldier who despised the SS, ignored Himmler. He ordered his troops to confine the SD units to their barracks for their own protection. It was a subtle mutiny. For the first time, the Wehrmacht in the West was acting independently of the party. The French resistance, or what was left of it, sensed the tremor. In the factories of Billancourt, workers slowed down the assembly lines. The fear that had kept Europe in chains was predicated on the invincibility of the Führer. Back in Berlin, the stalemate was broken by the intervention of the Army High Command, OKW. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the most respected soldier in the Reich, drove from his headquarters in Zossen to the Chancellery. He carried a pistol, but his real weapon was the weight of the Wehrmacht. He demanded an audience with Bormann and Goering. Manstein laid out the iron logic. If the internal fighting continued, the Eastern Front would collapse. The Soviet warlords would pour through the gap. The British and Americans would smell blood. The Reich would fall, not from without, but from within. There could be no civil war. There must be a compromise. The deal was cut in the smoke-filled cabinet room, over the body of the dictator, which still lay in the private quarters. It was a pact of mutual survival. Hermann Göring would be named the new Führer, satisfying the legal succession and the public need for a recognizable figure. However, his powers would be ceremonial. The real power would reside in a Reich Council for Defense, a triumvirate consisting of Bormann, party, Himmler, security, and Manstein, military. It was a monstrous hydra, a government designed to fail, held together only by fear of the alternative. On January 25th, the announcement was finally made. The state funeral was a spectacle of Wagnerian gloom. The coffin, draped in the swastika flag, was carried on a gun caisson down the Unter den Linden. The crowds were immense, marshalled by the party, but the mood was not grief, it was anxiety. They looked at Göring, sweating and pale in his white uniform, walking behind the coffin, and they saw a ghost. They looked at Himmler, his eyes behind his rimless glasses scanning the crowd for assassins, and they saw a predator. The new order had survived its greatest test, but it had changed. The messianic fervour was gone. The religious cult of Hitler could not be transferred to a committee of squabbling bureaucrats. The regime shifted from a charismatic dictatorship to a bureaucratic oligarchy. The Führer principle was dead, replaced by the committee compromise. The consequences for the empire were immediate. The efficiency of the state plummeted. Every decision now required the consensus of the triumvirate, who hated each other. The economy stagnated further as Speer, marginalized by the power struggle, could no longer override the demands of the party and the SS. The long stagnation deepened into a great rot. In the satellite states, the spell was broken. The European unity propaganda rang hollow when everyone knew the leaders in Berlin were holding knives to each other's throats. In Warsaw, a bomb exploded in a German-only cinema, the first act of violent sabotage in 3 years. In Amsterdam, a strike at the docks paralyzed the grain shipments for a week before the SS broke it with brutal force. The silence of 1945 was being replaced by the low, grinding noise of a machine that had lost its flywheel. The United States and Britain watched from behind their walls with fascination. The CIA, which had replaced the OSS in 1947, and MI6 pored over the intelligence. The analysis was clear. The monolith had cracked. The one-front war was no longer just against the Russians in the Urals. It was now a war against the Reich's own internal contradictions. In London, Prime Minister Halifax, now a very old man, he turned to his Foreign Secretary and uttered a phrase that would define the next decade of the Cold War. He said, staring into the fire, "Now the rats will eat the carcass, but rats are harder to kill, for there are so many of them." The crisis of succession did not destroy the Reich, but it hollowed it out. The trains still ran, but no one was quite sure who was driving or where they were going. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 17 years. What followed was not a golden age, but a long, slow, ugly decomposition. As the 1,950 seconds dawned, the world was no longer fearing the march of the jackboots. It was fearing the erratic, lashing spasms of a dying giant that was too big to fall, but too sick to live. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953 was intended to be a reaffirmation of the British Empire's enduring might. The route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey was lined with the flags of the dominions and the colonies, a kaleidoscope of colour against the grey limestone of London. The household cavalry rode in gleaming breastplates, and the street parties in the East End offered a rare break from the rationing that still defined daily life. But to the astute observer, the pageantry was a funeral rite for an age that had already passed. The broadcast cameras, now utilising the new Technicolor process, captured not the vibrancy of a global superpower, but the desperate nostalgia of a nation clinging to symbols because the substance had vanished. The cracks in the fortress empire had been widening for a decade, caused by the relentless tectonic grinding of the Sterling Wall. The economic system established in 1942, designed to siphon the wealth of the periphery to support the centre, had reached its breaking point. The colonies and dominions had dutifully paid the blood tax to keep the British Isles solvent and to pay the German ransom. They had sold their gold, wool, and rubber for blocked sterling that was increasingly worthless. The collapse began not with a riot, but with a ledger entry. In Ottawa, the Canadian Prime Minister, Louis Street-Laurent, faced a revolt from his own industrial sector. The Canadian economy, geographically integrated with the booming dollar zone of the United States, but legally shackled to the stagnant sterling area, was suffocating. Canadian factories, unable to import American machinery due to currency restrictions, were closing. The standard of living in Toronto was half that of Buffalo, just across the border. On the 1st of July 1953, less than a month after the coronation, Canada unilaterally abrogated the Imperial Preference Protocol. In a polite but firm cable to London, Laurent announced that the Canadian dollar would henceforth be pegged to the US dollar and that trade barriers with the United States would be dismantled. It was an economic declaration of independence. The Sterling Wall had been breached. The shock in London was absolute. The Chancellor of the Exchequer rushed to the BBC to denounce the move as a betrayal of the Commonwealth family. But the damage was done. Australia and New Zealand, seeing the Canadian exit, began to quietly negotiate their own trade deals with Washington, and shockingly with Tokyo, where the Japanese industrial machine was beginning to stir again under American occupation. The old Commonwealth, the white dominions that had been the pillars of the empire, were drifting into the American orbit. But if the dominions left with a handshake, the colonies left with a clenched fist. The Quit India movement, suppressed during the war years by the sheer necessity of survival, had returned with the ferocity of a flood dammed too long. The British Raj, stripped of its manpower to garrison the fortress island, relied on the Indian Army to maintain order. But the Indian Army, witnessing the humiliation of the British in Singapore and the economic rape of the Bengal famine, was no longer loyal. The flashpoint came in Bombay in August 1953. Dock workers refused to load crates of cotton destined for Lancashire at the imperial fixed price. When British officers ordered the Indian police to fire on the strikers, the police refused. The mutiny spread to the naval barracks. The Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, wired London with a stark assessment. We can hold India only by a reconquest, which requires 500,000 men and £1 billion. We have neither. The retreat from India was not the orderly, dignified transfer of power of the historical timeline. It was a scuttle. The British government, terrified of getting bogged down in a colonial war while the German threat loomed across the Channel, decided to cut its losses instantly. The Union Jack was lowered in New Delhi in early 1954, leaving behind a partitioned, volatile subcontinent that immediately descended into a civil war between India and Pakistan. Britain washed its hands of the chaos, retreating to its island, its reputation as a stabilizing imperial power shattered. The cascade effect rippled through Africa and the Middle East. The withdrawal from India signaled to every nationalist movement from Cairo to Nairobi that the lion had no teeth. The Suez Canal zone, the jugular vein of the empire, became a siege line. Egyptian nationalists, funded by a newly assertive American intelligence apparatus that sought to displace European colonialism with market access, began a campaign of sabotage against British garrisons. In London, the National Preservation Government finally fell. Attlee ran on a platform of realism and reconstruction. His mandate was to liquidate the unviable assets of the empire to save the welfare state at home. We cannot be the policemen of the world, Attlee told a hushed House of Commons, when we cannot even police our own balance of payments. The Great Recessional of the mid-1952 was a geopolitical landslide. Britain withdrew its garrisons from Palestine, leaving the Jewish and Arab populations to fight a vicious war for survival without a referee. They pulled out of the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria, granting independence years ahead of schedule. not out of benevolence, but to stop the financial bleeding. The map of the world, once painted a confident pink, became a patchwork of new, fragile nations. This retreat created a colossal sphere of influence vacuum. The timeline's bedrock truths, the isolation of the blocs, began to interact explosively. As the British retreated, the two remaining giants, the USA and the German Reich, moved in to pick over the pieces. Africa became the chessboard for a new kind of proxy Cold War. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, utilized the dollar diplomacy approach. American corporations, backed by the CIA, moved into Liberia, the Congo, and South Africa. They didn't want colonies. They wanted commodities. The German Reich, controlled by the triumvirate in Berlin, saw the African collapse as an opportunity to secure the tropical resources they had lost with the return of the colonies in the 1940 seconds. Using the Vichy French connection and the returned German colonies in Tanganyika and Namibia as bases, they began to project power north and west. German mercenaries, veterans of the Eastern Front with nothing to lose, poured into the continent, offering their services to local dictators and warlords. The Congo crisis of 1955 became the first direct friction point. It was a three-way struggle. A British-backed faction trying to maintain the old order, an American-backed faction seeking to open the mines to US corporations, and a German-backed faction led by mercenaries utilizing Wehrmacht surplus equipment. The jungle war was brutal, fought with modern weapons in a heart of darkness. It ended with a de facto partition of the region and the realization that the Pax Britannica had been replaced by the law of the jungle. For the British public, the loss of the empire was a psychological trauma that deepened the national malaise. The fortress was no longer the center of a web. It was just a lonely rock in the North Sea. The loss of cheap imperial food caused prices in British shops to skyrocket. Rationing, which had been easing, was reintroduced for meat and sugar. The poverty of victory became undeniable. The average Briton looked at their German counterpart, living under a tyranny but with full employment and a growing industrial base, and asked the dangerous question, who actually won the war? Culturally, the fracture of the Commonwealth led to a fierce anti-Americanism in the UK. The United States was viewed not as a cousin, but as a vulture that had feasted on the carcass of the empire. The special relationship was buried under a mountain of bitterness. British foreign policy began to drift into a sullen neutrality, a Switzerland of the North mentality. The Royal Navy, stripped of its global bases, was reduced to a coastal defence force. By 1956, the transformation was complete. The British Empire was formally dissolved, replaced by a loose, toothless Commonwealth of Nations. The Sterling Wall had fallen, leaving the British economy exposed to the cold winds of global competition for which it was woefully unprepared. The chapter closes with a symbolic image from the Suez Crisis of late 1956. In the original timeline, Britain tried to seize the canal and was forced to back down by US economic pressure. In this timeline, Britain didn't even try. As Colonel Nasser nationalised the canal, the British garrison simply packed up and left. The last ship to leave Port Said was a rusty troop transport, the HMT Empire Windrush, carrying the final rear guard back to Southampton. As it steamed out of the harbour, it passed a US Navy destroyer entering the canal to ensure freedom of navigation and a German freighter loaded with machinery for the new Egyptian dam. The British soldiers on the deck watched the two superpowers pass them by. They threw their cigarettes into the dirty water, turning their backs on the east, heading home to a cold island that was suddenly much smaller than they remembered. The metamorphosis of Britain was finished, from global empire to fortress, and finally to an irrelevant, shivering spectator. By the dawn of 1960, the geopolitical sediment of the post-war world had hardened into rock. The fluid chaos of the 1940 seconds and the crumbling adjustments of the 1950 seconds were over. The world had undergone its metamorphosis and had emerged as a creature of three distinct hardened shells. The tripolar world was not a dynamic system of shifting alliances and diplomatic maneuvers. It was a static architecture of fear, a planetary deadlock where the lines on the map were etched in concrete and enforced by nuclear fire. The first pole was the Fortress Hemisphere, dominated by the United States. Having retreated behind the hemispheric shield, America had evolved into a society that was simultaneously utopian and dystopian. Economically, it was a paradise of boundless consumption. The dollar zone, encompassing the Americas and the Pacific Rim, excluding the Japanese sphere. The 1,950 seconds in America were not the happy days of historical nostalgia, but a period of armed affluence. The interstate highway system was built not for family vacations, but as a military transit network for mobile missile launchers. The suburbs sprawled, but every home had a fallout shelter, and every neighborhood had a civil defense warden. Politically, the United States had become a security democracy. The FBI, under the Eternal Director J. Edgar Hoover, acted as the shadow government, vetting politicians, professors, and journalists for defeatist tendencies. Dissent was not crushed with gulags. It was suffocated by consensus. To question the shield was to question survival. The culture was aggressively patriotic, techno-fetishistic, and deeply paranoid. The television networks broadcast a sanitized reality, where the American way of life was the only light in a dark world. Hollywood produced endless films about the enemy within and the barbarians at the gate, reinforcing the isolationist psyche. The second pole was the European fortress, the domain of the Greater German Reich. The triumvirate of the 1,950 seconds had eventually dissolved, replaced by the Reich Senate, a grey collective of technocrats, SS administrators, and military logistics officers. The Führer remained as a ceremonial title, held by a succession of forgettable party loyalists, but the true power lay in the ministries. Europe had been pacified, not by love, but by lobotomy. The Germanization was complete. A generation had grown up speaking German as the language of success, viewing their national histories as quaint folklore. The physical appearance of the Reich was one of monumental brutality. Albert Speer's architectural vision had spread from Berlin to Paris, Vienna, and Warsaw. The cities were dominated by massive, neoclassical government buildings and brutalist concrete housing blocks. The trains were fast, the autobahns were wide, and the factories were automated. But it was a society without a pulse. Literature, philosophy, and art had atrophied. The Reich Chamber of Culture produced harmless entertainment, operettas, folk festivals, and sports spectacles to keep the masses distracted. The East remained a forbidden zone, a colonial meat grinder where the asocials and dissidents were sent to work and die in the uranium mines and agricultural combines of the Urals. The average European knew it existed, but they never looked at the map to the right of the Vistula. The third pole, and the most tragic, was the Commonwealth of Ghosts, centred on the British Isles. Britain had survived, but it had not lived. Stripped of its empire, isolated from Europe, and economically estranged from the United States, the United Kingdom had become the Switzerland of the Atlantic, a neutral buffer state existing on the charity of its neighbours and the scraps of its history. The Sterling area was a closed garden of genteel poverty. The British economy was a museum piece, relying on coal, textiles, and banking. London in 1960 was a quiet, smog-choked city of unpainted houses and polite queues. The Great Smog of 1952 had never really lifted, metaphorically speaking. The cultural explosion of the swinging 60s never happened. There were no Beatles conquering America. Rock and roll was strangled at birth by a censorship board desperate to maintain moral standards. Instead, Britain became a land of introspection. The Anglican Church experienced a revival as people sought solace in tradition. The royal family, shorn of its imperial majesty, became the focus of an intense, almost religious devotion. They were the proof that Britain still mattered, even if the world had stopped listening. The interaction between these three poles was defined by the silent war. There were no proxy wars in the Third World anymore, for the Third World had been largely carved up or abandoned to chaos. The conflict moved to the shadows of espionage and the high frontier of technology. The space race took on a terrifying character. In the original timeline, it was a race for prestige. In this timeline, it was a race for the high ground. The German program, led by Wernher von Braun, who never defected, launched the first satellite, Walküre Reversed, in 1955. It was not a scientific probe, it was a surveillance platform. The United States responded with the Vanguard series, establishing a network of spy-sats that circled the globe, peering over the walls. By 1960, the night sky was filled with moving stars that belonged to the militaries of the superpowers. The orbital wall was the new frontier. Both sides developed anti-satellite weapons, turning low Earth orbit into a potential battlefield. The fear was not of a bomber fleet, but of an orbital bombardment system, tungsten rods dropped from space that could obliterate a city without the warning time of a missile. The nuclear equation had also shifted. Because the uranium race had been a slow crawl, the arsenals were smaller but more potent. The United States possessed the super bomb, hydrogen bomb, delivered by the massive B-36 and B-52 bombers that patrolled the Arctic Circle 24 hours a day. Germany relied on its silent, nuclear-powered submarine fleet, the Grey Wolves, which lurked in the Atlantic Trench, capable of vaporizing the American East Coast. It was mutually assured destruction, but without the red phone. There was no direct line of communication between Washington and Berlin. Diplomacy was conducted through the neutral British Foreign Office, which found its only relevance as the terrified messenger between the giants. The cultural separation was absolute. An American citizen could not visit Europe. A German subject could not visit the Americas. The Atlantic Curtain was a zone of naval and aerial interdiction. The only exchange was via the Lisbon Link and the London Exchange, where approved literature, scientific papers, and films were traded. The Americans viewed the Europeans as brainwashed slaves of a totalitarian machine. The Europeans viewed the Americans as chaotic, racial mongrels obsessed with money. Technology diverged along ideological lines. The United States, driven by the free market and the defense sector, pioneered the transistor age. Computers became smaller, faster, and more integrated into the economy. The ARPANET was activated in 1959, connecting the universities and military bases of the Fortress Hemisphere. Germany, conversely, remained in the vacuum tube age for longer, focusing on heavy engineering, chemistry, and biology. Their computers were building-sized calculators used for central planning. However, they leaped ahead in genetics and pharmaceuticals. The Health of the Volk program produced breakthroughs in medicine that eliminated hereditary diseases, but the methods forced sterilization and genetic culling were secrets buried deep in the SS archives. The tripolar world was stable, but it was a stability of the graveyard. The Soviet Union was gone, reduced to a collection of warlord states in Siberia that served as a live-fire training ground for the Wehrmacht. China, isolated by the Japanese sphere, had collapsed into a century of internal strife. The Japanese Empire, the silent fourth partner, held East Asia in an iron grip, exploiting the resources to feed its own insular prosperity, uninterested in the quarrels of the white nations. On the 1st of May 1960, the nature of this world was encapsulated by a single event. An American U-2 spy plane, flying high over the Urals to monitor German troop movements, was shot down by a new German surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. In the historical timeline, this caused a diplomatic crisis. In this timeline, it caused nothing. Berlin issued a curt statement announcing the execution of an American air pirate. Washington issued a denial, claiming the plane was a weather research vessel lost off course. There were no summits cancelled, because there were no summits planned. There was no outrage, because there was no expectation of international law. It was just another friction point in the mechanism. Powers was not put on trial. He simply vanished into the night and fog of the German prison system. The American public shrugged, added another can of beans to their fallout shelters, and watched the evening news report on the launch of the new Ford Nucleon car. The British reaction was the most telling. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, speaking in the House of Commons, urged caution and restraint. He advised against provoking the Continental powers. It was the voice of a nation that had learned its lesson. The British Lion, toothless and old, just wanted to be left alone to sleep by the fire. As the year ended, a heavy snow fell across the northern hemisphere. It covered the concrete of the Atlantic Wall, the wire of the Urals line, and the manicured lawns of the American suburbs. Under the snow, the world looked unified, peaceful, and clean, but it was the peace of the cryogenically frozen. The metamorphosis was complete. The caterpillar of the 1,930 seconds, a world of chaotic, dangerous potential, had not become a butterfly. It had become a purely armored organism, devoid of soft tissue, designed only to survive in a hostile environment of its own making. The human spirit, that erratic, beautiful flame that had sparked the Renaissance and the revolutions, had been contained. It burned now only in the private recesses of the mind, hidden from the censors, the cameras, and the neighbours. History had not ended. It had simply frozen solid. The currents of change were trapped under the ice, and on the surface, the three giants stood watch, eternal and unmoving, guarding their hordes in a winter that promised no spring. History is a river that usually flows in a single direction, carving canyons of certainty through the landscape of time. We stand on the banks of our own reality, looking back at the rapids of 1,940, and we see the rocks that were avoided, the currents that were navigated. We see the miracle of Dunkirk as a pivotal moment of salvation, the spark that kept the flame of liberty alive until it could grow into a bonfire. But the river has other tributaries. The timeline we have explored, the world of the One Front War, is a tributary where the water ran cold. It is a world born not of a single catastrophic defeat, but of a single, logical military decision. By removing the miracle, we removed the friction of a two-front war. By removing the friction, we removed the necessity for the desperate, reckless alliances that defined our own history. In this reflected world, there was no D-Day. There was no Holocaust by bullets in the open, but a Holocaust by silence in the dark. There was no atomic fire over Hiroshima, but a slow, suffocating frost over the human soul. The peace of necessity that Lord Halifax signed in Amiens saved 300,000 men from death, but it condemned 300 million to a prison without walls. The tragedy of the metamorphosis is not that the world ended, it is that the world adapted. The human capacity for normalization is our greatest survival trait, but also our greatest moral flaw. In this timeline, the people of London, Berlin, and Washington learn to live with the unthinkable. They learn to accept that freedom is a geographic accident, not a universal right. They learned that the truth is whatever the state says it is. We look into this mirror not to see a nightmare, but to see a warning. The difference between a world of liberty and a world of concrete is often measured in inches. The depth of the water at a French beach, the hesitation of a general, the signature on a piece of paper. The butterfly flapped its wings, and the hurricane did not come. Instead, the fog rolled in, and it never left. The world of 1,960 inches, this timeline is stable, it is orderly, it is safe, but it is a world where the stars are watched by cameras, and the silence is the loudest sound of all.